I love Dead Rising. To be frank, it's terrific. I'd say it's a timeless classic, but such a statement might need an asterisk. Years ago on this channel I covered Dead Risings 3 and 4, one game I'm mixed on and one I can't claim to like, to say the very least. I talked about how they didn't stack up to the original and figured in doing so I'd gotten across what was so brilliant about it by proxy. I had not. I had crassly used a trophy as a bludgeon. Having recently revisited Dead Rising, it has only risen in my estimation. It absolutely needs to be talked about on its own merits, remaining to this day a uniquely engrossing zombie epic, one which mixes arcade sensibilities, especially their demands of memorization, mastery, and thin margins for error, with a depth of play which rewards not only mechanical skill, but improvisation and long-term planning both. It's a rich game, an intriguing puzzle box to solve, and all of this goes alongside a belter of a story. For this video, I'll be taking a leisurely tour through the game, as leisurely as Dead Rising allows anyway, exploring and turning over my own thoughts and seeing where the game leads me. I hope it leaves even veteran players with something new to think about. I've got a long history of this game and as a result more to say about it than the Willamette Parkview Mall has hot dinners. To that end, I've got 5 playthroughs we'll be jumping between to cover as much ground as we can, as well as a few other odds and ends, or oddballs and endings as the cases may be. And so we're all on the same page, despite its length, how granular I'm going to get, and the fact I'm going to be making a lot of declarative statements. This video isn't intended to be the definitive final word on Dead Rising. I wouldn't want to make that even if I could, because why would I want people to stop talking about it? I have a lot of love for this game, but that doesn't mean I've somehow understood it better than anyone else. Just that I'm taking the opportunity to linger with it. I've had years to ruminate on my thoughts already. More broadly, I find the way we talk about games both fascinating and occasionally frustrating, so at times I'm not going to be sticking exclusively to Dead Rising, but where the game itself brushes up against wider ideas. I believe the ways in which it stands apart from other titles offers a lot of room for insight and discussion which has been left unexplored. This video will contain spoilers, and I'll at least be alluding to late game revelations as soon as I feel they're relevant. If you haven't played Dead Rising, I thoroughly recommend doing so. If it clicks, I promise that coming to grips with and figuring the game out will make for an incredibly rewarding experience, and I can't overstate that it should be experienced as blind as possible. I'm sad I can't wipe it from my memory and experience it fresh, but that would have, more consequences than you might imagine, and it would delay the video, so it would have to wait anyway. And not that I'm calling it fresh, but I'm saving everything I have to say about Deluxe Remaster for the end, so if that's all you care about, you're gonna have to wait. And ironically enough, considering the game we're playing, it's the first thing we're all gonna have to do. I needed to sit through more than one loop of the title screen to get to the attract mode. Good things come to those who wait, as they say, and Dead Rising often contests, but this arrived slower than the Shamblers. It's a short film taking place shortly into the outbreak, long before Frank has arrived on the scene, following a mother and daughter trying and failing to escape Willamette as it falls to the zombies. It's a straightforward, simple story, which nonetheless packs a good amount of tension and terror into a brisk 4.5 minutes. Now, I do like it. It's a solid little mood piece. But is it Dead Rising's mood? It's at best just one part of the equation. While nowhere near as over the top as Capcom's other zombie romp, Resident Evil, can get, Dead Rising is on the whole still quite theatrical compared to this. Characters have big personalities, they deliver their lines with Hollywood-esque emphasis, and there's always a bit of a campy undercurrent with constant use of dark comedy and ironies, which keeps the mood at least somewhat freewheeling.
And what am I supposed to do when I get close?
Well, the best solution would be to shoot the guy.
Opening on a normal, unexaggerated woman and child hopelessly falling to the Horde feels like the beginning of a much darker tale. Not one where I'm about to plop the heads of serve-bots on zombie bonces and do combat with a crazed clown. Even the title card is different, and incredibly basic at that. Which brings me to what I think we're looking at here. Seeing as snippets from this cutscene appear in the initial announcement trailer, which itself carried a bleaker tone than the final product wound up possessing, this may well be a holdover from there, kept so as not to waste however much work went into it. Early on in its development, Dead Rising was a very different beast. From a proposed 10-day time limit to producer Keiji Inafune sounding apprehensive about describing the game as funny, saying it only had the possibility for comedy, whereas the final product is a relatively tight 3-day affair and manages a tonal juggling act with aplomb. I think Dead Rising would be a far less charming title where the scales of tragedy and levity weighed heavier towards tragedy, but we're never quite to know. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting this opening is anywhere near the same resort as Dead Island's trailer, for instance. What's here is far from completely off base, and does strengthen certain aspects of what's to come. Starting with the zombies at their most imposing makes sense, and it means that on each startup, if you wait for several minutes, you get a reminder of the kind of danger they present to ordinary people. Plus, I'm not going to claim there's no other downbeat moments in Dead Rising which are totally free of levity. They come along just often enough to give them extra impact. The final shot really elevates it. The camera booming upwards, music rising in turn as the two are overwhelmed before it cuts to black. Besides being a gut punch of an ending and showing you what kind of numbers you're going to be up against, it works well to bring us into the story of Frank West. It's almost a shame there's a start menu separating this from the regular opening cinematic, as it breaks what would otherwise be a strong bit of flow from one scene to another, not only connecting the two sequences spatially, but also juxtaposing the literal and figurative positions of each character. Starting with these two on the ground gives us the raw humanity of the disaster without the context. During Frank's flyover, he sees the entire scope of the situation, but observes impassively through a camera lens. A literal full frame of reference, but completely detached. Over the course of the story, he'll wind up having to bridge the gap between the context and the humanity in order to get the full picture. Something interesting is with how missable this cutscene is, the player may unknowingly be placed further into Frank's shoes, unaware of all the grisly details of the situation, and if you want their names you have to scour further, only putting names to faces in the manual. I said it's almost a shame, as while I do like the connection, it is still 4.5 minutes, which is tangential at best. This is why I think having it be an optional thing you can stumble on gives it the best of both worlds. It doesn't get in the way of the impatient while rewarding those who want to find everything. Being in a track mode means it serves the classic, soon-to-be pretty needless function of protecting CRTs from burn-in. Not that it matters, because people with CRTs are about to be burned in a whole new way. But putting that aside, the way the cutscene is handled overall feels like a common theme with Dead Rising. It may appear daft at times, but it's actually rather deft, the former almost feeling like a smokescreen for the latter. It appears this way because it has the confidence to not slow down and explain everything. It's on the player to keep up in basically every sense of the word. Time waits for no man, after all, and Dead Rising doesn't contest that idiom one bit. It will, however, contest this idiot quite a bit. Back at the menu, the story's found under the idiosyncratically named 72-hour mode. After launching it, we immediately see a date and time, September 19th at 11:27. The first thing Dead Rising does is put time front and center in the player's mind. And the specificity of the minute should help the player clock that we're going to have to treat time as granularly as an hourglass. Time is inescapable, and it's going to affect how we interact with every other mechanic. But we'll talk about time another time. For the time being, let's talk about the times. Dead Rising first released on August 8th, 2006 in America, September 8th in the EU, the 14th in Australia, and finally the 28th in its native Japan. Running a bit late there, lads. Still, happy near enough 20th anniversary. I've got to imagine there was at least some internal debate about releasing the game day and date with when the plot kicks off. I'm kinda glad they didn't though, as I don't think 13-year-old me would have been happy to wait longer for such a gimmick. Dead Rising is from Capcom, who would in a few short years enter their Crapcom era. Dead Rising, oddly enough, does feel like an early precursor to this trend. It was, like much of Crapcom's output, trying to win over the Western market. Prioritizing the 360 was a pretty sure sign of this. The Xbox line has historically done poorly in Japan. Capcom's games have always carried a Western appeal, but during this period they really went all in, alienating old fans and gaining few new ones. Dead Rising didn't hit the same pitfalls, however. Besides just being a well-made game in its own new series, it skews closer towards being a confident fusion of flavors instead of a pale imitation of a Western title. This also puts its release a little under a year into the 7th console generation. Dead Rising is to me a largely positive showcase of what this new tech could offer, and back when I was a kid, it was a major reason I went for the 360 first over the PS3. We see, or more likely miss, an aspect of that new tech right here. It's something kid me definitely didn't care about. Being the intro cinematic, it's obviously heavy on exposition, establishing who Frank is and why he's headed to this seemingly unimportant little town. I love the little look Ed gives, seeing Frank with his camera and almost deciding against interrupting before curiosity gets the best of him. It's a small gesture, but it goes a long way into making the following exposition believable as it feels motivated by Ed's character, and it's conveyed through a level of expression which shows off the kind of details games could now casually convey. This wasn't entirely new, mind. Half-Life 2 was almost a couple years old by this point and was lauded for its facial tech, which was still way more impressive than what's on display here. And back in 2006, year-on-year graphical improvements were still noticeable. But it's the growing confidence in the ability to convey these details on a console without having to sacrifice in other areas to achieve it. The other aspect of why this exposition works is it's serving double duty. Frank isn't just flatly explaining the situation, he's offering insight into what kind of man he is.
That's right. Got a tip that something big's happening.
In a nowhere little town like that? They sure didn't mention anything about it on TV.
Yeah, well, I'm freelance, pal. I don't make my living waiting for the TV to tell me what to cover.
The writing in Dead Rising is economical and characterful. Put simply, it's snappy. Exposition is often seen as a necessary evil. It's something viewers dislike when they notice it, so it needs to be disguised, dressed up, or very well motivated to be easily accepted. Frank immediately tells us everything we need to know about him. He's cocky, can even be a bit of a cock, but he's proactive and personable. His nonchalance about the military presence hints at his experience and that he's a bit of a daredevil. There's a lot more to him which we'll quickly discover, but for now, this is all we need to know. He's exactly the kind of guy who's going to have himself flown into a quarantine zone and then trap himself back there to chase a story. Your classic intrepid reporter. Resourceful, daring, and as all men should be, a little stupid.
I want to get shots of the whole town before the National Guard finishes roping it off. Take me over the main street.
Our first bit of interactivity is Dead Rising's take on a shooting gallery. This has a nice effect where the game can continue to set the stage while introducing the player gradually. Much like how time is immediately put in the player's mind and then reinforced, the first thing we get to do as Frank is take pictures. This is to him relative normalcy. Snapping shots from a safe distance is what he'd ideally like to be doing. This allows said normalcy to be stripped away from him as the player gets to play the game they paid for. He goes from shutterbug to survivalist, and so do we. In gameplay terms, photography is a secondary concern at best, and the extrinsic motivation to engage with it evaporates quick. During the early game, when levels aren't too far apart, photos can be a meaningful source of XP, or prestige points as Dead Rising would have it, so snap some sexy pics and raise that PP. But as the levels accumulate, the camera's usefulness as a leveling tool quickly falls into ever-widening experience gaps. This section establishes its importance narratively while making sure the player knows the camera is there, has a basic grasp on how it works, and knows the mechanical benefits for using it. To that end, we're flown through a series of pretty stock zombie or catastrophe scenes. A man fighting from the roof of his car, a bus under attack by the Horde, a gas station explosion, and so on. These scenarios are all well-trodden ground, and they all play out exactly as you'd expect, and this predictability serves a purpose, helping a player learn how to best use the camera. By telegraphing each of these so heavily, we pretty much teach ourselves that the big dramatic moments generate the biggest rewards. The moment you see the petrol station and Ed brings the helicopter to a halt, you know exactly what's about to happen. I'll bet most of us don't even see the building. We already see that juicy fireball in our mind's eye. It doesn't need to do anything else to build anticipation because what other purpose could it serve? The only thing it's here to gas up is your score. The smartest thing about this sequence, however, is it can be skipped on subsequent runs, so returning players can just get into the meat of the game. And I say this as someone who quite happily replays this section, trying again and again to sharpen up my shots and capture the perfect moments. It's as Frank notices the crowd forming outside the mall, he tells Ed to drop him off.
Can you get me on the rooftop of that mall?
You gotta be kidding me. Man, you are nuts.
All right, listen. Don't forget to come back for me.
As long as you're not dead, Fred.
It's Frank. Frank West. Remember that name, because the whole world's gonna know it in 3 days, when I get the scoop.
All right.
With our time limit set and Frank dropping a pretty hard line, the military come in to spoil the fun. Not the last time they'll do that before we're done here, I'll tell you now. Still, Frank makes a break for it. And almost gets broken for it. His daredevil antics result in him immediately eating shit, brought down to earth in more ways than one. It's a strong comedic beat which punchlines the excitement and reveals an important aspect of Frank at the perfect moment. He isn't an action hero. For all his bravado up in the sky, he's an ordinary man who has just unknowingly flung himself into something way over his head. His humbling is immediately followed by just the man to let him in on that fact, as he's accosted by a rejected design for Resident Evil 4's Lewis.
You're the reporter, aren't you?
Yeah.
You came alone.
Yeah, I'm freelance. You know, go on the battlefield alone, no crew.
Carlito is a flamboyant flashbang. His design and his demeanor are an instant reminder that, oh yeah, I'm playing a Capcom title. This whole interaction is hilarious, and we can debate how purposeful that is. Carlito acts so foreboding. He's a toonie chewing the scenery, not even hiding his power level, or that he knows more than he's letting on. And Frank's reaction is astounding. At the same moment he's making it clear he's not just any old wanker with a wide angle and has a grip on why the situation is suspect. He is simultaneously no-selling every red flag this weirdo is staking into the ground with seismic force.
Doesn't sound like civil disobedience. It's too quiet.
Almost as if everyone's already dead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Carlito. Turns out you can't aura farm during a drought. I think he's a little discombobulated from the tumble.
This, my friend, is hell.
But hell is in Michigan. Joking aside, Carlito is established effectively, if a little awkwardly, which may only further help him stick in the player's mind. The game sees no reason to pretend he isn't on a level, and why bother? His plan is already underway. Frank's suspicions wouldn't stop it now. Once the cutscene ends, we can talk to Carlito. His dialogue suggests Frank wasn't the only reporter he invited, just the only one who turned up. Oh, you want a nice picture? Sure, here you go.
Good.
Lucky for us, Frank keeps the flash off. With the shirt this bugger is wearing, the camera might feel inadequate. Keeping with things being a little off-kilter, Frank's running animation. There has been an odd amount of debate over the years as to why Frank moves the way he does. Is it a limp from the fall he just took, or him shielding his camera? I definitely lean, like Frank does, towards the latter. I just don't see him compensating for a busted leg much in that run animation, and if you have him walk, he's perfectly fine. In early footage, you can see Frank holding certain weapons in a typical two-handed style, while the run cycle they ultimately settled on had Frank give equal priority to his camera, which tells me this is something they wanted to emphasize. At a jog, you can see he's making an effort to handle his gear and keeping his center of gravity on the camera to reduce sway. If you've ever had a camera strap around your neck, you're likely well aware that if you've ever had to move quick, you shift your gait to compensate. That's unless you don't care about an expensive bit of metal flapping around everywhere. I've seen posts online alluding to a cutscene where Frank explains his limp, but I've never found an actual source on this despite a good amount of searching. I'll say I could be wrong, but I'm going with what seems reasonable to me going off of the game itself. Either way, it's a nice bit of animation. It's a distinctive run cycle, and ironically enough, if it is a busted leg, helps Frank stand out. I adore how what's important to him is communicated, perhaps imperfectly given the years of debate, just in the way he moves. To Frank, survival and getting the scoop are clearly given equal weight. Given how we often overlook a character's inventory, Capcom could have easily gotten away with having the camera disappear when not in use and given Frank a standard walk cycle, and I doubt anyone would have raised questions. It's a stretching of reality we've long been primed to accept. It's not always appreciated when a game goes the extra mile, and, well, we've still got a ways to go when it comes to Dead Rising. Frank's idle and running animations vary depending on his surroundings. When near hordes of enemies, he visibly tenses and runs with his arms flared, ready to defend himself. He also has a pained variation, as well as occasionally breaking into a scramble, desperately fleeing from whatever it is that's got him running. This reactivity to his surroundings makes him feel like a living, breathing person, and that in turn makes the world feel tangible. It's these small details which do a greater job selling verisimilitude than all the cutting-edge graphics in the world. Also, speaking of stumbling, I somehow never noticed this cutscene. 2 decades and I'm still learning things about this game.
What in the world?
As Frank makes it to the entrance, he finds some surviving Willamites setting up a barricade.
Madonna,
Quit screwing around!
have you seen my baby? I can't live without my precious little sweetie doggy. Oh, where is my Madonna? Where is she? Oh, Madonna.
But it isn't them who grabs his attention.
Hey, this is no time to ogle pretty girls, son.
What, you from the remaster? I mean, clearly not, look at you. Something you may have noticed about Dead Rising already is it makes frequent use of medium close and close-ups. The camera isn't afraid to get in tight with characters, which shows a lot of confidence in the model and texture work. Which makes sense. You don't put a photography system in your game unless you believe it can stand up to scrutiny. I don't consider myself a graphics guy in the slightest. Just watching my videos would out me as a hypocrite if I tried to pretend otherwise. But I'll stick my neck out and say I think Dead Rising looks good to this day. That said, It's obvious these models are well past the point of being on the cutting edge, if they ever were, and stylistically were always a little uncanny, which has only grown more noticeable over the years. However, I'd argue this winds up working in the game's favour as it bolsters what these shot types are going for. Tight, close-up angles can be used to make the viewer feel claustrophobic or trapped. This combined with POV shots puts you in Frank's shoes. The cinematic language is telling us that we are trapped in here with this lot, and their off-putting appearance and unsettling mannerisms make that fact uncomfortable. The look holds up because the ugliness of these assets are put to use beautifully. I hate saying games age because I think it's wank. It's really more that our expectations make us more tedious over time. But this is aged like wine. Wine exposed to sunlight, but still, it's serendipitous at the very least. So getting in Frank's face works, and we're conscripted into building the barricade.
All right, then. Feel like making yourself useful? Take a look around the mall. Bring anything we can use for the barricade back here. Andale! Come on, pronto!
But first we've got these lot. While sadly none of their conversations are subtitled, each of the scattered survivors are having their own little dramas. They're all soon to be bit players, and there's nothing drawing you to them besides your own curiosity. Given they exist just to be wiped out, it is a nice bit of effort. The more you build something up, the more there is to knock down after all. It's as Frank approaches their stockpile he runs into yet another suspicious character.
You! Stop right there! Do you have any idea what you've done? Why did you summon me to this place? What are you planning?
Would you calm down? I don't even know what you're talking about.
Funny how both of them are on the wrong side of a shutter.
What the...
Uh-oh, someone's causing a commotion. Something I'm only just thinking about now is, given what caused the zombies, there is a slight irony in their getting into the mall thanks to someone's selfish and thoughtless love of an animal. I'm going to wind up giving this game's storytelling a lot of props as we go along, but this one I doubt was to create some long-shot narrative parallel. It's just something that works to get the ball rolling. As a person who's kept animals my whole life, I'd be gutted, perhaps not as literally, if I saw my pets in danger, but I'd like to think I'd hold myself back, and not require several men to fail to do so.
What in the hell are you people doing? Run! Quick, move! Get over here! Everyone, move this way! Quick, to the stairs! Move!
So the zombies have broken through, and we're not exactly thrown into the deep end, but with our backs to the wall, we're going to have to part the undead sea if we want to mosey on out of here. This is what Dead Rising's all about. Big hordes of zombies, and you've got to use whatever you can get your hands on to get by. I love this sequence. The scale of the horde, one of the key selling points, is on immediate display, and making us have to contend with it first thing closes out the intro with a bang. Starting the player next to a pile of random clutter is very sharp. Objects traditionally thought of as improvised weapons like 2x4s are placed in and amongst plasma screens, bins, and benches. The game immediately flags all of these up as equally viable implements. It allows a player who may not be aware in on the fact that they can use anything and everything at their disposal, in case they missed the memo. You may not think a bench a bludgeon, but Dead Rising tells you it doesn't need to sit this one out. It's actually one of my favourite video game weapons after this revisit. The thing hits like a truck and shows us how weighty the game is wonderfully. Look at that beautiful hit stop. All the surrounding Willamites are wiped out in the wave of undead. Their health are officially lowered to add impact to the sequence. I am left to wonder if this sets a bad example for the game ahead. If you could save them, it would take away from the immediacy of the moment. This is meant to be a pulse-pounding escape sequence after all, but during the rest of the game you are expected to go out of your way to save people. I know everyone will respond differently. Most, I imagine, will just see this as an escape sequence. Some might feel even better about saving subsequent survivors because they had to leave these ones behind. It could also be telling a player that while a survivor dying sucks, it's not something the game is going to grind to a halt over. It is ultimately up to you what you do with your time, which is going to keep on ticking long past the point they do. Perfect. Lastly, one thing I do quite like is if you were paying attention, you'll have noticed one of the survivors carrying a shotgun. This is a little undercut as he switches what side of the pool he's on when the attack begins, but it is still present. The shotgun acts as a bonus objective, and it's a really tempting prize. Only issue is Brian has drawn by far the most attention, so going for it is incredibly dangerous, especially at low levels. But if you take the risk, you can walk into the early game with some buckshot as backup. And well, the stumbling never quite stops. Turns out I was unaware of another hidden cutscene. Granted, ignorance in this case may be considered commendable. Should the player fall during this sequence, they'll be saved by Otis of all people, which is pretty amusing. Learning about this has been odd because I can't say I'm sure how I feel about it. I think it's a fair thing to add. It's probably what allows Capcom to feel comfortable swarming the player with so many zombies right away. And optimistically, a player who gets this result first time may feel more invested in doing better from that point onward, and add to their own personal story of playing through the game. It may also leave a player with warmer feelings towards Otis than those who made it out by themselves. This outcome better establishes him as someone keeping an eye out for others, even if it is patently absurd he's the one who pulled you out of there. Besides that, it could even make one particular late-game revelation about Frank feel more like a Chekhov's gun finally going off. As someone who never knew about this, I can't help but feel, perhaps unfairly, that an illusion of danger and excitement has been ripped away, and now I can't not know that this sequence isn't quite as intense as I'd always believed. Which is ironic because said intensity was founded on it never actually being too much for me to manage. I don't think it'd be fair to say the game had tricked me, more that it had never had to account for me in this way. It allowed me to be blind to this sliver of fairness. Among people who watch game critics, there is a lot of debate over how skilled we ought to be. I myself think that any skill level is fine. Someone who only plays games on easy mode can still offer a valuable perspective. What matters is if you account for where you're at. In this case, my relatively above average ability blinded me to an aspect of this game for 20 years. A small one, sure, but still something I was never aware of. Just as an unskilled or mediocre player may not be able to grasp concepts which only matter to those at high levels, experienced players may well miss the safeguards not there for them and how they might affect the experience, and ironically enough, in the process, wind up overestimating the game's true difficulty. That's part of why game critique and critics can never be one size fits all. There's far too many variables to account for. Skill levels, personal tastes and biases, different elements of games leap out to different people, and we all have our own differing motivators and demotivators. And as we've just seen, different skill levels can lead to different experiences and expectations, even in a non-obvious fashion. Either way, Frank gets out of there in one piece.
Where are the others?
I don't know.
Frank says, Brian's shotgun tucked down his trousers. We close out the intro being introduced to the last few members of the principal cast, Brad and Jesse, as well as little old Otis there, torching the door shut when many players would prefer he took that welder to his own gob. Meanwhile, Brad and Jesse aren't too talkative. Brad has little patience or interest in Frank's questions, and his cohort delights in messing the guy around.
Are you a photographer?
As a matter of fact, I am. Frank West, photojournalist.
Could you show me some pictures, Frank?
I praised the ugliness of the characters earlier. Ironically, I don't think I can extend this to Jesse, who is, for my money, the ugliest character in the game. I'm being serious when I say that, by the way. She, along with Isabella and a few female survivors, are supposed to be the game's eye candy, if Frank's steadily rising penis of view didn't tip you off. But Jessie I've always found off-putting, and this isn't me being a prude. More that she is clearly meant to be appealing, but in trying to make her cute, she winds up looking wrong. Dead Rising style can handle chunky blokes, homely women, and at a push sexy ladies, but I don't think it can do cute. She looks like a doll manufacturer didn't know whether they were making baby or hamster heads and decided to split the difference before plonking the mold on a burlap sack. It's less TNA and more what the fuck's in your DNA. That aside, the two's condescension and secrecy towards Frank winds up backfiring. For all Jessie was taunting him, she couldn't hide her interest in Barnaby. Rookie mistake. Brad's evasiveness and apparent understanding of the zombies lets slip that there's a deeper mystery here. I find that second detail odd, but it could just be Brad being confident in his suppositions. Either way, Frank is motivated to defy them and keep on digging. After collecting a map and transceiver from Otis, we make our way back into the mall.
anybody around?
Up on the rooftop, we run into our tutorial survivors, Jeff and Natalie. I'm not going to get into all there is with escorting right now, given this hardly counts. With no zombies and just one obstacle, the only danger here is long-term, for the rest of humanity. How the hell did you two get separated? Is saving these two truly the right thing to do? Granted, not being into eugenics, and given the age of these two, it's probably too late to stop the Meyer family from spreading, something we can clearly see they're good at, if nothing else. Hopefully the PP they provide will go towards rescuing more deserving people. Actually, don't count on that. It's a bit of a contrived scenario, but this does bring me to something I'm going to give Dead Rising survivors a lot of praise for. And that's just how many of them are doing something unique, and/or pulling double duty. Jeff and Natalie don't just teach you survivor commands and the survivor drop-off point, they lead the player to both warehouse entrances. This isn't the most vital information, but it doesn't have to be. There's little to otherwise lead you to the side door, which could speak to the difficulties surrounding designing a space to be realistically large instead of condensing for gameplay purposes. But the survivors in this case smooth that out and hopefully put the idea in your head to be investigating the less obvious nooks and crannies. Them running into each other's arms afterwards has a long wind-up and it's quite a long animation thereafter. This shows us PP opportunities, and later ones aren't going to be quite as easy to capture, but now we know it's something to be on the lookout for. These myriad distinctions help each survivor stick in your memory, which is important as planning and plotting runs is a challenge Dead Rising asks of the committed player. Few if any survivors are totally generic. They're set apart by circumstance, behaviour, and occasionally function. This not only helps them stick more easily in your memory, but makes it feel like you're saving people instead of cookie-cutter NPCs, even if how they behave post-recruitment takes a sledgehammer to that whole illusion. On top of that, these two are so easy to save that I think even the most impatient player is likely to do so, even if just to be rid of them, which is where they learn escorts are a PP bonanza, making clear the mechanical motivation for moving these morons. And with that, the carrots on the dipsticks. Brad's missing out. Actually, how did Brad not collect you two? Actually, I guess it makes sense. Jeff asked if Brad had seen his wife and he was sick of all the questions. This is where impatience gets you, folks. You miss out on PP. After dropping off the sappy couple, we're free to head into the warehouse. But something's here to sneak up on us.
Zombies, huh? Had a feeling you'd show up. Oh, God, it's you.
And no, I'm not talking about Jesse. I'm talking, of course, about Dead Rising's legacy. With Brad under fire and Jesse no longer so hot on her heels, it falls to Frank to take up arms.
All right, fine. Give me your gun.
You know how to use this?
Kinda. I've covered wars, you know.
There it is, a line more infectious than the zombie plague. I'm going to be honest, as a kid, I didn't get what was so special about it, only learning after the fact from message boards that people found this one to be a gutbuster. And nowadays it's a dead meme of sorts, as the rest of the franchise absolutely ran it into the ground. They kept making Frank regurgitate this line as if it represented him, even as he mutated into a vastly different character. I believe a lot of the affinity for this line comes from just how unbelievably awkward it is, but I don't take it to be poorly acted. Now, video games have a long history of shoddy voice work, and Capcom absolutely played a part in that.
When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wowie.
Some of the nostalgia for the original Resident Evil lies in its incredibly wonky acting, which is referenced in this very game with the restaurant Jill's sandwiches. And while I'm not saying there hadn't been good performances before this point, I find the 360 generation is where the general quality stabilized. To that end, I think I've Covered Wars, you know, falls into a similar category as Cletus's Laugh, where because of said history, moments which may be intended as awkward can be misinterpreted as genuine fumbles. It's always a tricky thing to gauge because we ironically find imperfect diction to be distracting, even though in real life we stumble over ourselves all the time. Making that clumsiness feel natural instead of artificial is a minefield all its own. I don't take this as clumsy acting, but a well-acted moment of Frank being clumsy. The uncertain delivery of something which is meant to inspire confidence, the shaky logic that since he's a wartime reporter he can be trusted with a gun, and it coming on the heels of Frank having an actually fairly convincing argument, as though this was meant to be the slam dunk. Frank even sounds partway through delivering the line like he's realised how absurd it sounds, but he started talking, so he'd better keep going. Unlike Cletus's Laugh, I'd say this line still works even if you believe it to be unintentionally off-kilter, which likely doubled its staying power. You get years of nerds like me debating what exactly happened here. It's an aspect of Frank's character I really like, which this moment exemplifies. He's only clever enough by half on top of being foolhardy to a fault. He acts before he thinks and then has to think of a way out of where his actions have gotten him. It's a fitting personality for a video game protagonist, as it makes our actions when in control of Frank feel that little bit less contradictory. He, to some extent, matches our rashness. You can even see Jessie hesitate for a moment before realizing she has no choice but to trust this bumbling oaf. I'm sorry, Jess. You're Otis tier now.
Look, after I'm through helping you, you and I are gonna have a nice little chat.
And we get our case file. Story events are segmented into groups of scoops coming one after the other. Do them all and we get a break. Not always in the case, but a wee time out from the story. Then when the next case rolls around, it's be there or be square oblong. And we're out into the game proper. We've got 6 hours to crack cases, scoop scoops, save survivors, and mess with and mess up as many undead as we can along the way. I'm not going to delve into as much detail for each wing, but I really do think the Paradise Plaza is special. While a lot of the mall follows a traditional setup, long corridors flanked with shops, the Paradise Plaza plays host to a far more open design. Given the presence of cafes, diners, benches, plant life, and how it leads to the cinema, it's easy to imagine this was the indoor leisure spot. A little oasis of calm which isn't actively funneling people in any given direction. This all translates into gameplay. Besides the healthy mix of shops sporting weapons and ready access to food items, the geometry massively favours the player. The non-linear layout makes evading zombies simpler, and on top of that, the bodies of water and flower beds create bridges and thin pathways. These changes in elevation part the hordes and drastically slow them down. This not only makes the area far safer, especially for new players as it offers plenty of raid spots to retreat to, it immediately illustrates that evasion is a valid strategy. Even acting akin to racing lines, guiding us into how to navigate around zombies, which is a skill we're going to take with us wherever we go. The stairs leading up to the first floor are particularly inviting, and a rule is established where upper areas tend to be less populated, with Paradise Plaza's upper level being practically devoid of danger on day one. This is balanced by upper floors having very few connections to other plazas, meaning for actual travel you're always going to have to brave the ground floor. It's up here we come to Colombian Roastmasters. I'm going to bet this place is the first port of call for any Dead Rising veteran when they're headed out to tackle an objective, being a font of fruit juice with a convenient blender nearby. Not only that, dropping down onto this cover will earn us a katana, one of the many hidden weapons dotted around the mall. Given how big and obvious this spot is in its proximity to a powerful and unlimited foodstuff, I can't help but think the game is showing its hand a little. We're ironically led by the nose so the game can tell us that we should be exploring. It tells us that with no Asda in sight, we're the George of this jungle, and clambering up and down is not going to go unrewarded. I know Kid Me had to look up a few hidden Uzi locations, but I wouldn't have even known to Google for them in the first place if the game hadn't practically pulled me to this blade. This canopy also lets us easily cut from the upper floor in either direction. Routing, cut-throughs, and lateral interpretation of the environment is going to be key. I'm sorry if I sound a little awestruck over this awning, but I just think the Paradise Plaza is such a well-plotted place, where many of the game's rules are wordlessly established. The game is still relatively linear at this point, with the entrance plaza blocked off, we're funneled towards our first objective, which takes us out into the leisure park. An incredibly spacious courtyard which connects several points across the mall. It's an area which is, for now, low risk but slow to traverse, especially with survivors in tow. The size of the area also lets a player get a decent look at how big hordes can be without risk of being overwhelmed. The zombie population grows day by day and the mall gets packed shoulder to shoulder. This gives us a preview of what we'll soon be crammed into tight quarters with. It's while we're passing through that Otis rings us up with our first scoop queue, as they're called. These are our optional objectives where we can save people strewn about the mall or go to face psychopaths, the game's moniker for its boss fights. They're a true call to harm, and for many, the radio system made us want to direct said harm at Otis himself. While on the radio, you're defenseless, you'll drop any items which can't be stowed away, and to top it off, any and all interruptions will result in the call being terminated before Otis angrily calls back and chews you out over how rude you are, indifferent to the fact that zombies have likely taken an even bigger chunk out of you. His message will then reset. Tragically, there's no button to ask the psychopaths to hold up for a moment while you take a phone call. This literal insult on top of injury has earned Otis a huge amount of scorn over the years. Odd as it may sound, I wonder how much of the ire for Otis is purely mechanical, as opposed to how he frames having to call back as a failure. While it's not a perfect analogue, I remember Persona 5's Morgana drew a ton of frustration on release for being the one who told the player when they had to go to bed. Ending many days, not even early, they were always scripted to end here. This was never gating any actual content. But it still feels like you're being robbed of control. The thing is, this happened just as much in Personas 3 and 4, but there it was framed as the player character choosing for themselves to hit the hay. It's functionally the same, but never inspired anywhere near as much antipathy. In the earlier games, the framing left a far less obvious target for the player's frustrations, given they are debatably self-inserts. It led to more jokes than outright anger. The player feels far less patronized, even though mechanically the exact same thing has just happened. People still wouldn't like the radio, but I wonder if feelings would be softened if Otis called back with a message of concern instead of consternation. Or better yet, just continued where he left off. The popular image of Otis may have been more likably bumbling than it wound up. One of the few universally well-regarded changes in later games was replacing the transceiver with a hands-free set. I will later put forwards not even really a defense. I'm going to put forward a hypothesizing for the radio later. For now, I've got some buckshot for Brad. To back him up, I mean. I love the look of sheer disappointment on Brad's face. Yeah, bud, it's me again. Now I've got questions and a gun. So am I going to be building a case or spending them? Sensing an opportunity to get rid of the pesky journalist, we're sent out to draw fire, and Brad forcing another pistol in our inventory makes us drop our creamer, so the plot to get Frank killed is well and truly underway. This brings us to our first boss, and the deck is pretty stacked in the player's favour. We've been given multiple firearms, Carlito's position limits how much space he threatens, the space itself is the food court, making it easy to nip out of the fight and grab a bite to eat. Yeah, bad news, Willamette patrons. The food court pizza is reheated garbage they get out of a box. This is the kind of hard-hitting journalism worthy of a level up. And we've got Brad here too. Well, we've got Brad here too. As a first boss fight, it all feels very measured to aid the player, especially given the heavy emphasis on firearms, which Frank struggles with, using a stop-and-pop firing style similar to Resident Evil 4, where you have to pick your moments to stay still and line up a shot. And Frank is a lot more lumbering than Leon, with the crosshair having a heavy dose of acceleration and deceleration rather than stopping and starting clean. Frank does warn the player in the preceding cutscene he's not a crack shot, and that follows in gameplay. So I think as much as this is a first boss, this is also a relatively safe opportunity to get used to firearms, which are the way to go against a number of bosses. This is also the only boss encounter with a second phase of sorts. After enough damage is dealt, Carlito will retreat to the back row, which offers greater cover and makes flanking far trickier. It's a solid means to ramp up the difficulty. It maintains the tactics of the fight while reducing the player's margin for error. The second phase is something conspicuously absent from all other psychopaths, who all possess one behavior they'll follow beginning to end. I can't say this encounter is prepping the player for the general rhythm of Dead Rising's bosses because there really isn't one. They're more focused on creating distinct scenarios where the personality of the boss dictates how the fight plays out. Some follow what we might consider a standard boss fight rhythm, while others are a lot more unique. So this is a bit of easy work. Carlito's chased off, and now Frank has a face-off with Brad. After shutting down his fangs and learning our backup is only good enough for a buy and not a byline, Frank draws his smoking gun. Thanks to Jesse's slip-up, multiple, Frank was able to come prepared.
You guys are looking for someone here, aren't you?
Who is that? Where did you take it?
You help me, I help you.
Damn. You're one hell of a journalist, aren't you, Frank? A hot-headed, underhanded, hotshot paparazzi with nothing better to do than to invade people's privacy.
I try. You got a point?
That's such a good exchange, and it's where I began to really like Frank way back when. While the guy is oscillating between cocky and cock-up, him being a dogged journalist really shines through. To see him get one over on Brad establishes his credentials. It's genuinely refreshing to play as a proactive and clever protagonist. Plus, it's rare to have a heroic character who has such an underhandedness and low cunning, but remains endearing in spite of that. I think we all like our heroic dickheads, and Frank stands out for me as one of gaming's best. Another strong aspect of this scene is we learn Brad and Jesse are DHS agents. It plants the seed that the ultimate obstacle to Frank uncovering the truth isn't going to be the zombies or Carlito, but his own government. Dead Rising is ultimately going to paint the American government in a pretty grim light. But while these two are agents of it, I think starting here is a good way to get this particular plot thread unfurling in a layered way. While they begin obstructive and rude to Frank, Jesse and Brad are ultimately blameless. They're unknowing pawns and arguably just as much victims to the decisions made above their heads as everyone else. Whatever version of the truth they're withholding from Frank is unlikely to be the full picture, just as much as it's convenient for them to know to get the job done. From their perspective, Frank looks like a self-interested muckraker muddying the situation and making it harder for them to do their jobs, and the thing is, they're not entirely wrong, at least in the beginning. It's this interesting contrast of a sleazebag who's in the right versus a by-the-books agent who doesn't realize he's playing his part in defending the indefensible. One thing I like about the uneasy alliance of Frank and Brad is they're both ultimately well-meaning in their goals, but are both in positions which require them to act shady in order to do what they have to do. So yeah, we're getting some strong conflicts going. And naturally, Frank, having secured the win, can't help but then cock it up and maintain his Bumble King credentials.
Hey! So do I have your permission to cover this story? Or not?
Putting all the highfalutin talk aside, Frank and Brad's dynamic is just fun. Frank so desperately wants to be slick, but he ain't an oil spill, which plays well against a no-nonsense agent who simply has no patience for his showboating. The two head off to go pick up Barnaby. This takes us through the open-air Fresca Plaza. The only noteworthy aspect of this space is how unnoteworthy it is. With no psychopath battles and its only cutscene being in the flyover, its relevance, as well as the joint itself, is thin, packing you in with the zombies even during day one when the hordes are at their slightest. This is balanced out by the surplus of strong movement-based weapons like benches, chainsaws, and parasols. While they all have trade-offs in attack speed, durability, and damage, they all excel in allowing Frank to easily traverse a crowd. And Brad's behaviour is interesting. He's one of a small handful of survivors who don't navigate in the usual way, i.e. loosely attached to Frank or his orders. He acts far more confidently and courageously than most NPCs, which sets him apart, and his route keeps him feeling somewhat autonomous. He's still not explicitly on Frank's side or following his lead, but has his own goals which just so happen to align with ours. He's on a set path and follows it enthusiastically, making this more of a scripted sequence than a standard escort mission, and as such, it's unlikely he'll die and may even mop up a few undead for us. Dead Rising is a difficult game. While I'm far from great, I will make it look much easier than it is, especially starting out. But I do believe it goes out of its way to break newcomers in gently. The opening carefully curated to be a bit leisurely, taking you across wide open areas, stacking a boss fight in your favour, and then practically escorting you through the first cramped space you'll cross post-opening sequence, which happens to be Fresca, an area with good traversal tools and a good amount of food towards the back. Arriving at the entrance plaza, we find out where Barnaby booked it, and he's not budging.
You can't just arrest him?
Frank, mate, it's not the sodding Sims. An arrest isn't going to warp him through the barrier, you tic-tac. Anyway, with that done, I guess, we've only one objective left in our first case, which is just checking back in at the security room before 6 AM tomorrow. So, I'd say we've got some free time to free roam. Otis even calls us up and encourages us to grab some fresh duds, apparently hating Frank's fit enough he can't even bear to see it through the crusty CCTV system. This encouragement is likely meant to get a player to stumble into Bill, further drawn in by the zombies circling the store in which he's trapped. I don't know how many playthroughs it was before I chanced upon the guy back in the day, but I distinctly remember I didn't find him via a guide. He disappears when Case 2 begins, and given his predicament, Otis doesn't explicitly call him out. Bill is the first of a small handful of unmarked survivors, usually placed near objectives in the hope the player is going to stumble into them, adding further complications to whatever it was you were expecting to do. I've got to introduce some temporal trouble into this video, however, as I didn't actually collect Bill at this point. I was playing dumb. But don't worry, at some point I warp him to safety. Seeing as we're not allowed to head right back into Paradise, the game is nice enough to make backtracking into Fresca pretty explosive.
Perfect.
The shopping trolley is an interesting item. It's both a weapon and a vehicle, literally depending on how you approach it. Why this is important is vehicles can't go through any door-based transition, only open ones. However, if come at from a different angle, the trolley can be hoisted like a heavy weapon, meaning we can actually carry it through doors and expand its range to the rest of the mall. It's an interesting example of how Dead Rising isn't just shallow weapon variety. They really did try, even if it's in a small way, to make every object in the mall unique, which is commendable. Not everything has this much depth, but it's a delight when an item has more utility than you might expect. And they all at least handle pretty uniquely, which adds to the tangibility. It does mean Frank occasionally uses stuff in really bizarre ways, but it speaks to the fact Capcom were not half-arsing the assignment. Pretty much every weapon has its own physics, its own weight, its own even slightly different swing or stab or throw. It may even be 2 items in one. Yeah! And that's awesome. even if it does mean you may wind up with some axes to grind. It was as we were making our way over to Brad, we got word of another guy running around the mall taking pictures, so naturally we've got a shutterbug to squash. This takes us back to Colombian Roastmasters, where as we've established, good journalism usually begins. Only right now it's playing host to a man who is anything but super. Say hello to a complete and utter Kent. The moment he learns Frank's also a photographer, he has to establish dominance. Frank's reaction is pretty telling. He doesn't challenge the guy, just lets him run his mouth and then tries to get out. As a teenager, I thought Frank was being oddly meek here. It's only coming back years later, having met similar sorts, I've realised he was probably playing nice so he could get out of there and save his incredibly limited time. You get the sense he's dealt with this type before and wants nothing to do with him, because these people are time vampires. Unfortunately, this backfires and we're shanghaied into a second, far worse photography tutorial. We have to get shots of him in specific poses which will allow us to clear his score thresholds and escape pictorial purgatory. This is probably my least favourite task in the game, as it is really dependent on his incredibly squirrely AI, though I may have just had especially bad luck, and yes, all of you are going to say the whole game depends on squirrely AI, but I've learned to accommodate that one. This is a good moment to dig a little deeper into photography. It's a simple system, but not what I'd call picture perfect. Composition matters less than decomposition, and it's not about the rule of thirds, but the rule of hertz.
Perfect.
Gamifying what makes a good picture is obviously a subjective and tricky thing. Luckily, Dead Rising's premise comes in handy here as it guides our photography. We're covering a zombie outbreak, so it's easy to imagine photos which tell the story are prioritized. I'd say for what Frank's role is, a picture like this is far better than something like this.
Perfect.
But the scoring system has it the other way around, and not without reason. Gameplay demands a risk and reward, so proximity to danger is best emphasized. What matters is filling the frame with as much stuff as possible, as close up as possible, no matter how horrifying.
Fantastic.
I'm obviously not holding this against Dead Rising. A scoring system which emphasizes risk and reward makes sense. It's the most exciting and easily passable way to implement photography. After all, games are best at dealing with objective outcomes. It's why combat systems are more involved than things like dialogue. It's far harder to tell what wins or loses an argument if you really want to capture the nuances of speech. And if you've ever argued with someone online, you'll know they don't have life bars, even as you feel your own draining. By that same token, it's impossible to objectively judge what makes the perfect photo. It's not something a machine, or really any one individual, far more complicated than any computer, can say with absolute authority. Even though, yes, there are pictures we can easily agree are bad. Giving photography a simplistic scoring system was the best way to go. But besides what I've already said, there are some Dead Rising specific shortcomings. It's prone to missing what seem like obvious score cues. I've never liked the PP sticker system, but that's out of a distaste for object hunt gameplay, and I don't begrudge its existence. The biggest issue is the system's limited lifespan. Once a player has taken and saved all the pictures required for objectives, which isn't many, they never need to engage with the system again outside of 2 scoops, neither of which permit much creativity with the feature. Lastly, the game has 5 photo categories, but only one of them has any function whatsoever, meaning before long, photography is a boondoggle. Emphasis on the boon though, because I still like it. Any game where I can snap photos just wins points with me automatically, regardless of the score system.
Perfect.
Still, I tried to come up with a way to give the system indefinite value for a larger number of players, and one rough idea I had was giving photographs temporary effects dependent on shot type. So say brutality shots lend Frank a damage buff, outtake off his immunity to stagger and other stun effects, erotica boosts movement speed, drama raises the overall stats of followers, and horror grants damage reduction, with their duration and perhaps intensity decided by how highly the picture scores. This is already somewhat balanced out by the camera needing to be recharged every 30 shots, which can only be done at 3 points in the mall, another aspect of navigation and time management which fades alongside the camera's relevance. I don't think this is a perfect idea, but it would give the camera a persistent utility. Though part of me does wonder if it would make the pictures themselves feel throwaway and shallowly motivated, which may be a bigger loss than it sounds. At the end of the day, despite imperfect implementation and arguably underutilization, I just can't help but get a kick out of the photography. I love how Frank's character and role informs the gameplay to such a meaningful extent, and I'm not yet done discussing how. While I'm failing to get this shot and have just failed the transmissionary achievement, let's dig into Kent. His introduction is timed well. He's likely to be ran into shortly after Brad dresses Frank down, which provides an important contrast since Kent is everything Brad accuses Frank of being. I can't help but wonder if this is meant to illustrate to the player that no matter how sleazy Frank comes across, he is the real deal, because now we get to see what a real vainglorious low-life voyeur looks like. Frank is genuine about what he does, and as such doesn't need to put on airs. He carries one camera because part of his job is staying mobile and getting the truth, not guzzying it up. Which is a little ironic given what the system rewards, but the point stands. Meanwhile, Kent is just a twat with a telephoto or 20. He clearly has no real desire to crack the case or put it in any meaningful context. All he cares about are his photos, even though without any curiosity as to why things are happening, they are utterly devoid of substance. His existence places Frank's character into a better light by contrast. One of the interesting, though likely unintentional parts of Kent being a side character is sure, he's acting like a big shot. But if left alone, he's utterly inconsequential. That's something video game storytelling can uniquely do. Given what Carlito said earlier about Frank being the only journalist to show, he clearly has no idea about Kent being on the scene, which makes his arrogance all the funnier. Either Kent was in town by sheer happenstance, or he's acting like a hell of a big shot for a guy way out in this podunk little town, and either interpretation is pretty funny to me. A fun fact I've been unable to verify is Kent's voice actor, Marty Belawski, was at one point set to play Frank instead of TJ Rotolo. Apparently when you hear Frank's
Fantastic!
That's Belawski's voice you're hearing. I struggle to notice a difference, but that's on me. If true, it's an odd path to take, going from leading role to his optional dark reflection. There's still a little bit of Kent deep in there, Frank. You can't deny it.
Fantastic! Perfect!
Okay, here comes the next one, Frankie. But first, feast your eyes on my work. Now this is my most emotionally moving shot. Now this is my sexiest shot. Okay. This is my most violent shot. Check it out. Ugh.
Frank is rightfully disgusted. Our brutality shot was way better.
Okay, here's the deal, Frankie. You gotta go out there and take even better pictures than the ones I just showed you. You think you can handle that, huh?
Frankie accepts the challenge, and I'll jump ahead to me trying to get what I think is a prize-winning shot. The prize is a spot on the sex offenders register, but at least it means we'll stay shoulder to shoulder with Kent. I'm using a unique book from a nearby shop which highlights PP categories which I'd otherwise never make room for, just wanted to show it off here. My disappointment with this scenario is that it's always an erotica shot, when I feel this should have been randomized run by run to at least give the other categories purpose. This is worsened as Kent is one of the only protracted series of scoops, and I think it's the one area where the 3-day format backfires. I genuinely misremembered this photo challenge being a 2-stage affair. Erotica and then brutality before Kent snaps and goes to an extreme to outdo Frank. Even that would feel incredibly rushed, but he actually loses his marbles after one picture. You do his tutorial, same photo challenge each time, likely skipped on subsequent runs as you save the photo which strokes his cock and not his ego, and then on to the final encounter. It needed room to breathe, but Dead Rising is already a pretty breathless game, and it wasn't going to slow down for anyone. Least of all this twat. This all said, if it was going to be any one category, erotica is probably the best pick there is, as it is ironically the hardest to come across. As for what I'm doing here, I can't help but feel making us do this is a joke at our expense. I get the feeling Capcom were hoping we'd catch ourselves trying to snap a saucy photo of zombie bits and just say to ourselves, what am I doing with my life? This is actually the first time I've ever attempted this objective, I guess, the proper way. Teenage me just didn't have it in him, I suppose. Getting big erotica off of zombies is difficult. And you know, it probably should be. Just because the dead are rising doesn't mean we ought to be. Still, I eventually got it. The snatch is snapped.
Perfect.
What am I doing with my life? I also realized later on you can use Jesse for this. Moving on. Our first proper survivors arrive within scant hours of Kent, sending us back across the mall to Fresca. And yes, I think it's safe to call Aaron and Burt our first proper survivors. I mean, their names start with A and B after all, and they are very much Alpha and Beta. It's worth noting you do not need to respond to scoops. These are optional objectives which net you considerable PP and occasionally another little prize. This was actually a consideration behind Frank's role as a photojournalist, as explained in this OzGamers interview. It was important to Capcom that the main character isn't a cop or a fireman, because it implies that that person has responsibilities. They should be saving survivors and things like that. Capcom want you to be the everyman, because who you save is up to you, and they didn't want you to feel like you had to play the game in a certain way. I try to save everyone and do everything because it fits my idea of what the game is about and who Frank is. But that's just my interpretation, and there's plenty of room for others. The mechanically motivated get experience out of it, and even once you pass level 50, there's a scoreboard at the end of the game which maintains at least some pure gameplay reason to engage with survivors. Though to my knowledge, Dead Rising was never a big score attack game, and the one time I checked the scoreboards back in the 360 days, they were hacked to buggery, so no point there. Meanwhile, for the more intrinsically motivated or roleplay types, you could see Frank as doing this because he's actually a decent guy underneath it all. If you don't see him quite so virtuously, he could be saving these people because as a journalist, that's more people to corroborate what's going down here, or lets him become the story. There's arguments for either the selfless or selfish explanation, and Frank's dialogue with survivors doesn't contradict either viewpoint. If a player is especially invested, they may see Frank's reasoning changing over the course of the 3 days, which the intro definitely helps support as an arc. But there's also room for people who just don't want to engage with the survivors. Frank has no professional obligation nor the training which make him the man for the job. He's an ordinary guy already trying harder than most to get by. I think player psychology does suggest that if you present someone with a challenge, they default to believing the game is tasking them with completion, not merely offering it as a suggestion. But that's only an assumption, even if it's usually correct. I'm about to say something odd, and that's mostly why I want to say it, but it could be argued that Dead Rising is one of the few games where the side missions are intended as supererogatory. The game does arguably guilt you with big accusatory death messages, but it never forces your hand. It's a neat and tidy set of affairs which winds up accounting for a range of different mentalities, conscious or otherwise. It turns out in character design and photography both. Framing is quite an important thing. As I said, I like to save people, so we're going to be doing our level 4 best out here. Aaron and Burt have set up a barricade, which few others have bothered to do because the physics are wonky. Burt will immediately take Frank for an intruder and attack. It's quite a risky trap to spring on the player. He'll surrender with plenty of slack, but I have to wonder how many people beat Burt to death not realizing how quickly he'll throw in the towel. Perhaps this was to get a player thinking about how to heal followers by making you damage one in a relatively safe environment. I say relatively given we've just destroyed their barricade. Still, they have some food nearby and it's likely you'll have at least a moment of safety afterwards. I also just like Burt as a first survivor because he's standing up for his far less capable buddy Aaron, so I'm kind of endeared to the guy. I get the sense he's a good bloke, so I want to help him out. Leah, meanwhile, has one of the darker stories in the game, and she'll tell you all about it. If you go for the other two first, it can be quite worrying since you'll be out of action for several seconds, during which time zombies can heap on a lot of damage. And Burt may already have a few lumps in him. Frank's pep talk here harkens back to what I was saying a moment ago. He immediately jumps to saving a kid, but when he learns that's not an option, he gets Leah moving with some pretty harsh words. Frank isn't a knight in shining armor. His attempts to help people are clumsy, blunt, and occasionally impatient, and that does keep him somewhat relatable. And with that, we've gathered up 3 people to save. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to reckon they're part of why the connecting hallway between Entrance and Paradise remains closed until tomorrow, as it would make ferrying these lot back way too easy. But isn't that an odd thought in and of itself? Conventional game design wisdom would suggest making the first time experiencing a feature as straightforward as possible, so that you can learn its rules and adapt as additional pressures are applied. Start with maybe 1 survivor, not too far from the drop-off point, and with no gimmicks. Establish a baseline from which to deviate in all subsequent encounters. Dead Rising, however, is not a conventional title. You're immediately saddled with 3 survivors, possibly 4, on a long haul, and they all have distinct quirks. One is aggressive, one is a coward, and one requires assistance to move. I think it's fair to say whatever training wheels Dead Rising may have had were just kicked clean off. But let's dig a little deeper into opening with such a tall order. Given Dead Rising's structure of a short campaign with a focus on replayability, the team likely figured a dedicated player is going to see the opening hours many times over. In that case, it makes sense to just get the ball rolling and hit them with engaging scenarios as quickly as possible instead of making them wait for things to ramp up with each and every reset, which would become monotonous far more quickly. For all I said, the intro guide's a newbie, and I stand by that. Once you know what you're doing, you can blitz your way to the true sandbox in a brisk 25 minutes, faster with skipping cutscenes, level ups, skateboards, mixed drinks, and unlockable power weapons. Much like earlier title Way of the Samurai, another game which features a short replayable story, part of what makes the game interesting is there are some incredibly tough objectives that can be found within moments of hitting start. But it's unlikely you'll have the chops to get past them for several runs and discover what content lies beyond. In that game it's story, here it's experience and occasionally new toys. This approach is far from unfounded, and when games have a replay-based structure it can be better to just let people get into the thick of it, allow them to risk experiencing failure and hope that they'll have the mindset to take it on the chin, and then circle back around to it when they've got more experience under their belt. I'm sad this approach of short but heavily varied games is so unexplored. Or maybe I've just not found them. But the point is, this is Groundhog Day of the Dead. If you want to do things perfectly, you're going to have to go through a few cycles until you know everything you have to do. These guys are only truly our first survivors once. On replays, they could be escort numbers 51 through 54. Seeing as survivor deaths don't end the game, it's not quite as harsh as it seems. And a failed rescue or two may make the eventual save all the sweeter. I'm going to apologize now because I'm not even actually getting to escorting them yet. And there's yet more atypical just about how these guys are introduced. Leah arrives an in-game hour, or 5 real-world minutes, after Aaron and Burt. The radio is perfectly capable of dropping scoops back to back, meaning this staggering was more than likely intentional. It's possible for a new or forgetful player to have picked up these two, made 5 minutes worth of distance, then get the call about Leah and have to weigh up doubling back, which can be a pretty frustrating choice to make. Scoops also can't be triggered if you're on the same map in which they start, so you can't simply pop yourself across from her and wait. It's a cruel trick to play, one which I've been victim to more than once because I have the memory of an apocryphal goldfish. It's what I figure many would call bad design. But I don't see it that way. I'm going to ask, is the game unfair, or is the game portraying an unfair situation? To some, the distinction won't matter, but I find it refreshing how the circumstances we're placed in are allowed to be messy and chaotic. If it were orderly and fair, that would take some of the bite out of a zombie apocalypse, and we can't have that. As I've said in the past, it takes friction to make fire. This does a better job capturing how downright lucky Frank would have to be to actually get everyone out alive if this were his one and only shot at surviving Willamette. By breaking standard game design expectations, Dead Rising makes itself more memorable. To me, this unfairness is a feature, not a failure, because time is not on your side. I mean, putting aside the fact we effectively have time travel, so it all comes out in the wash. Besides that, I need to hammer in the distinction that Dead Rising isn't about doing things quickly, it's time management, knowing where to be and when, and that's a fair bit more involved. Sometimes to do things right, you have to let events simmer a little, triaging your options and discovering when best to step in so you can scoop everyone up all at once. If you're paying attention, this trap can no longer catch you unawares, and from there, not letting it snag you is a win all by itself. I've checked out other videos, and it's cool how we all seem to prioritize different survivors in each batch. There is a degree of flexibility, and it's interesting to see others' strategies at work. My routing changed quite a bit over the 5 runs as I relearned the game and tried out different approaches. So if you're thinking I wouldn't have done it that way, I can only really cover my approach to Dead Rising, and yours may differ. This is the first thing which makes Dead Rising's time mechanics more of a neat puzzle box than a blind race against the clock. Trial and error is considered a dirty word, but just like these 3, it has its time and place, and that's here and now. Or would it be 5 minutes from now? It's appropriate it took this long for me to actually get to talking about escorting, because this preamble was practically as laborious as the act itself. In a 2005 interview, a guy dubbing Inafune said,
I personally feel that the zombies aren't the scariest things in this game. The scariest things in this game are going to be the people.
And mate, you succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. If you're even passingly familiar with Dead Rising, this is probably what you know about it. The survivors are fucking brain dead. They're slow, feckless, incompetent, frustrating, deaf, dumb, blind, frankly undeserving of your rescue. Counting the zombies, Carlito's terrorist scheme may well have risen the town's average intelligence. The only defense I could put forward for their implementation would be mired in masochism. So, let's get to the self-flagellation. Perhaps the most frustrating thing is how they handle commands, which is to say, they don't. When they're not being infuriatingly hesitant, they appear to be downright ignoring you. I'm reminded of similar complaints about Trico in The Last Guardian. Am I comparing these guys to a weird giant bird dog? Yes, but I think it's fair. A little bit of noise in an AI's behaviour can be good for making them appear not as an artificial automaton. In The Last Guardian, it achieved the effect of making Trico act convincingly like an animal. Where this comparison breaks down is Dead Rising doesn't have a little bit of noise, it has deafening static, where survivors often stand, deadeningly static. With all that in mind, I can't blame people for disliking the escorts. I think the thing players hate most in games is having their agency or input questioned, and these lot defy the belief that you're in control of the situation. But there's the rub, you're not. I don't know that I would do much better overcoming my fear of navigating a horde of creatures who could kill me in an instant because a not particularly persuasive paparazzi told me to. If there is any way in which their actions seem real, it's that they come across as really afraid. I grew up hating escort missions, as many of us seem to, and I still reflexively recoil when faced with even the prospect of one. And Dead Risings are some of the most demanding in gaming. But enough time spent here and I wound up no longer seeing that demand as an inherently bad thing. I don't think what I'm about to say will flip a mental switch and make them palatable to all, but the way they act presents a challenge I can't find quite anywhere else, and there is value in novelty itself. No other game captures what it is to handle zombie movie-like survivors. Slow, scared, out of their depth. You take these often doomed extras and can actually see them through to the end, and that deserves some credit. The thing is, Resident Evil 4 demonstrates that Capcom can make escorts smooth as silk, but the same values which made Ashley work for her game would have trivialized things here. And really, the survivors are far from impossible to work with. They add complication and texture to traversal. You navigate them all like a video game character. They navigate it like a vague and insulting approximation of a human. Routes which are a cinch when traveling alone become impossible, adding an extra layer to charting a course through this sea of zombies. Do you sail through a storm or circumnavigate it? It forces you to re-examine the space through another set of eyes. Sure, I had moments of pure apoplectic rage at their absolute Darwin Award contender moments.
Get over here, you fucking cunt!
Can't be said I wasn't emotionally invested, and I think that's also what makes getting everyone out alive feel like much more of an actual achievement. Never mind the literal achievements for doing so, which was part of this revisit, coming back to knock the Saint trophy off my gaming bucket list, something I never managed way back when. They strongly contribute to the push and pull of the timer. You want and occasionally need to rush them, but it's incredibly risky to do so. They enforce a gradual pace which is genuinely stressful to slow down to. You need to be constantly checking to see if a zombie has grabbed them, or even just their attention, and halted their progress. Their needs must go above your own, even if you have places you need to be. I find the best way to handle them is to scout ahead, spot openings, make heavy use of markers, and cover them as they move. Once you settle in with the survivors, every rest stop and crossed hallway becomes satisfying, a little win all by itself. Geared up, they've even saved me a few times, and it's always a pleasant surprise. I know this explanation isn't going to work for everyone. The survivor system is gaming Marmite. I've got an odd affection for it, and I'm trying to find the words which won't make me sound insane as I describe why. I think even among lovers of this game, we do have a degree of cognitive dissonance. We know it's a blemish, but we love it, warts and all. Over time, it just wound up being part of the title's abrasive personality, a charming and occasionally infuriating quirk. Learning to herd these guys is a unique skill, and seeing them move efficiently is rewarding, and it just wouldn't be if it wasn't on some level a struggle. I just find it fits perfectly well into the overall structure. They're not at odds with the timer, and as a matter of fact, they add much greater stakes to it. Still, what I'm doing right now does feel foolish. To defend this implementation is to join the losing side of history long after the dust has settled. The biggest thing they made sure to do in later titles was make the survivors less of a hassle. In vanilla Dead Rising 2, they were so bafflingly capable, I swear off the record switched gears and toned them back down. Which makes an odd amount of sense. In a post-zombie society, the remaining people are naturally going to be a little more rough and ready. Meanwhile, Frank probably still holds a lower opinion of people. Turns out, off the record doesn't really have good or bad AI. It has mediocre II. Or imagined intelligence. It was during my second time escorting Aaron and Burt, having fallen into the time trap on this occasion, which I'd evaded by sheer luck on my first run, where a most unfortunate incident occurred. Well, if I've already failed to be a saint, may as well be a sinner.
Perfect.
Shotguns share a property with a small handful of other weapons, to my knowledge snipers and sledgehammers. They're able to headshot and instantly kill survivors, all the more reason Aaron's charge at Frank is quite risky given his proximity to a DIY shop. But before you get too excited, no, this doesn't work on psychopaths, because they've lost their minds already. I'd genuinely forgotten I could do this, and while I feel I should be annoyed, I was laughing too hard to care. Given how this property is so selective, I'm willing to bet they knew a player would stumble into this perfect moment of shock horror slapstick. Dead Rising I find an incredibly funny game. I'm not talking about its writing, although I'd say it does fine in that department. It gets more smiles out of me than many of its contemporaries when it wants to. I'm talking about something far less lauded and with far more bathos. Dead Rising has really fun physical comedy. And that should be obvious, but here's the thing. This isn't just because of what we can do to the zombies, which is obviously quite a lot. It extends to the player. We are not immune from, and can at any moment become the butt of the joke. Frank's pain is often presented as funny. This is one of the best animations in gaming. Frank staggers, he falls over, hard hits have him cartoonishly pirouette through the air. Even his dodge roll has him land awkwardly and struggle back to his feet. Once again reminding us this isn't an action hero, but an average guy. He has a ton of inconvenient little animations and habits, which I can't help but think were intended to be characterful and at least a little amusing. Looked at it this way, Frank's helplessness with the transceiver could be seen as the extreme end of this. In a horror comedy, a man desperately trying to avoid death while having to take a phone call is a workable premise for a gag. So, why do we struggle to find this funny? Well, because in an interactive medium, we're not laughing at Frank, we are Frank. And frankly, I find your laughter, and lack of it, upsetting. We are not primed by games to laugh at our misfortunes just as many struggle to laugh at themselves. I do wonder if the emerging friend slop and streamer bait genre has had an impact on this, as it's a quality many of those games encourage. And on a similar note, I believe Dead Rising benefits from understanding that we are not in control, but struggling for it. It's a high-stress situation where you hopefully look back on your blunders and see the funny side, where you understand that your successes have meaning because you were never insulated from failure. Contrast, especially when it leads to levity, can be a powerful addition to horror. It goes together like coffee and donuts. The bleak black bitterness of my accident, and the sweet jammy hole in Aaron's head. You're either annoyed on my behalf or find schadenfreude in my loss. Honestly, I'd prefer the latter. I was so entertained by this cock-up, this lapse in judgment, where I forgot shotguns are one of the few weapons in the game capable of instant killing survivors. It's a perfect moment of farce in a horrifying situation. The game going, did you really think that was a wise move? And in all honesty, I can't say I was thinking in that moment. Some would wince at this. The joke should never be at the player's expense is the standard refrain, especially since Dead Rising is already so punitive. But in this case, all I've lost is some experience, as well as an achievement and with it, a completely cosmetic article of clothing. While I do have my issues with the arbitrary nature of headshots, given it's a rare example of Dead Rising selectively enforcing realism purely to the player's detriment, it's so specific, makes a weird degree of sense, and I can't imagine the logic behind it was anything more callous than this would be really funny, that I can't really begrudge it being there. I think the game should be allowed to do as it pleases, and I wish more had it in them to withstand being the butt of the joke. If you can laugh along with failure, you can't really lose. Though I have to admit, I can't help but wonder if, were I in worse spirits when this happened, or maybe if I was on my 5th run where I was dead set on getting that achievement, would I be as charitable? Still, it's a mistake I'm honestly glad I made because this moment was so much more memorable to me than the many times I saw these two to safety. I even think about it more and with greater fondness than finally getting that Chivo. Maybe part of my later success could be attributed to learning not to point shotguns at people's heads. This firearm safety thing is easy. Oh, come on! I believe the player being just as much a victim to the game's whims is a big part of why Dead Rising is so of a piece. We're in no way inoculated from our and Frank's shared role as the hapless everyman who bumbles his way into saving the day, and it doesn't round off the edges of what being in that position would entail beyond a leveled up Frank being pretty tanky, which really only means more punishment to take. The game isn't doing this to annoy the player. Annoyance is a byproduct of ensuring overcoming what's in our path or staying on our feet is an actual accomplishment instead of just being a matter of course. And all of this somewhat clumsily brings me to Dead Rising's controls. Frank's movement is wonderful. He has just enough heft where his movements aren't glidey or detached from the world around him, but remain sharp enough where it's possible and incredibly rewarding to artfully dart through and around packs of zombies. This makes it graceful without being weightless. I describe Frank's control as precision lumbering, especially when acting, as it's then he becomes quite a bit stiffer. Frank commits fully to every action and every attack. They lock him in. He has to halt to throw objects and aim weapons. As we unlock more advanced techniques, their inputs are often unintuitive, requiring you to pretzel your fingers a little, showing how out of his comfort zone Frank is performing them by making the player share in the effort. Meanwhile, a possibly unintended little mechanic is how the jump doubles as a dodge. Given the games from Capcom, developers of the Devil May Cry series, there is room to believe this was purposeful. It has just enough air control to allow a player to do light turns, and while the timing is much tighter than a dodge roll, it's easier to pull off and has a much faster recovery, making it a rewarding little trick to master. I don't know when I discovered jump dodging, but it's honestly so intuitive it was probably quick. Tapping jump as a panicked reaction just makes sense. The overall control layout is simple to start with, but Frank still has plenty of functions. I'm a fan of the game's use of holding the attack button for heavy or alternate strikes. I like this method as it simply yet intuitively conveys the extra effort of the strike while keeping an extra button free. It's ideal for games without combo systems. Basically any weapon can be thrown, and depending on the object it may even have special properties in place of a standard toss. Frank feels incredibly flexible on the whole, and this is bolstered by the sheer amount of weapons and unlockable techniques gradually introduced into his arsenal. Lastly, to reiterate, Frank is incredibly susceptible to being staggered or stunned. Control is often ripped away from the player for extended periods when taking damage or making a mistake. I think this is what leads to controls being erroneously called bad, because they're less accommodating for casual or thoughtless play. They give the player far less room for error, which often leaves us victim to the aforementioned comedy. We are, before we come to grips with Dead Rising, Mr. Bean in the land of the dead. Anyway, this brings me to a long-ass diatribe about bad controls and how we talk about them. One thing which pushes my buttons is when someone defends non-standard control setups as bad on purpose to evoke a feeling. By doing this, one immediately puts themselves on the back foot by essentially conceding they are defective. Look at it this way, if they're achieving the effect they set out to do, they are not bad on purpose. They're working as intended, but in a way we're less used to. I think it's a bad habit to meet something unfamiliar and immediately assume something is off. Now, I'm not trying to be too harsh on these people because I think their heart is in the right place. It's a pitfall I myself fall into because it's deeply ingrained in how we talk about games. We call heavy controls cumbersome, slow controls sluggish, tank controls clunky, and so on. Such controls do exist, but I feel we apply these labels far too quickly and broadly. The issue is the most common, easily understood terms for these things all have negative connotations, which I believe leads us into being too quick to judge and unfairly shapes our thinking. It's a semantic issue, as many of gaming's dullest arguments often are. By trying to defend non-standard evocative controls as bad on purpose, we just open ourselves to easy dismissal. It only takes one person who's not even trying to hear what you're saying to rebut, yeah, but why make it bad on purpose? And most casual listeners are going to be swayed. I'm not saying bad controls don't exist, by the way. I think if anyone has the authority to say bad controls are definitely out there, it's me. What Dead Rising has are deliberate controls. It demands you think out your actions ahead of time and forces you to commit to them. And commitment is the operative word. Dead Rising is a high commitment title. What this means is attacks have long wind-ups and wind-downs, and there's few or sometimes no way to prematurely end an attack without taking damage yourself. This bolsters Frank's sense of weight, and I believe it contributes to Dead Rising having such a meaty feeling of impact with so many of its weapons, which possess large, spectacular swings, doing a great job of selling the effort Frank is putting into what he's doing, while still maintaining this man is not an expert fighter. He stumbles and overextends, putting way more strength than technique into everything he does. High commitment games tend to put more focus on timing, positioning, and paying extra attention to what foes are doing. You have to observe and think several seconds ahead to judge whether an action will be safe to take, and if you miscalculate, damage may well be unavoidable. Frank's well-tuned movement in combination with his lumbering attacks work well together. Like so much of this game, combat is about being in the right place at the right time, and failing to do that leads to more protracted and pronounced blowback. Low commitment games, meanwhile, are more reaction-based. If a player realizes an action was made in error, they'll typically have the ability to withdraw through some kind of cancel mechanic. That's assuming they're quick enough, given low commitment games can more safely quicken the pace. I will say low commitment games have an easier time looking viscerally thrilling, and despite the higher time investment to get good, they're more often seen as fair since an experienced player has a more pronounced feeling of control over the situation. This is a broad overview, and there are titles which don't have the generalities I've outlined, but I hope I've given you an appropriate framework. Both of these approaches present unique and enjoyable experiences when done right, and I'm happy to be open to both. There's a concept called automaticity, essentially a flow state. To use a loose sports example, in football, learning how to effectively dribble, especially at speed and even more so when other experienced players are nipping at your heels, can be incredibly tricky. This is why in high-level play, you'd want a player to be able to pull off this incredibly intricate motion without even thinking about it. Putting active thought into a complex action increases the likelihood you'll in some way mess it up. Your mind needs to be focused on things like the larger game state and overall strategy. In these cases, not thinking about what you're physically doing decreases the likelihood of error as muscle memory takes over, bypassing a complex thought process which would otherwise bog you down. And that's automaticity. What deliberate controls do is make automaticity harder to achieve, and this is generally seen as a bad thing, because we see it as the game getting in the way of itself. It seems inherently at odds with key motivators like immersion. I think in most people's minds, the best control scheme is one which creates the smallest distance between the player and the game, which gives us the greatest sense of oneness with what's going on screen, and gets out of the way in the process. If you agree with that assessment insofar as you think this is a mark against Dead Rising, then I'm sorry to have led you into a bit of a trap, because these controls are perfectly evoking Frank. He stumbles, he misjudges, he has to fight cautiously or he will die. He's likely overthinking every action. And for what Dead Rising puts you up against, I think it's a good example of a high commitment game achieving its goals. The zombies are lumbering but dangerous if underestimated. The bosses themselves, while more dangerous than Frank, are not elite fighters save for two, and even then one of them is emotionally compromised. They're unstable people and their fighting styles are stilted, full of slow and showy attacks which give the player ample time to evade and respond. In Dead Rising, the fun is in the figuring out, and the satisfaction is in using positioning, distance, and knowledge to overcome deadlier opponents. It all, once again, goes very well with the timer. You're always being pressed to rush, but with this combat and these controls, you need to sacrifice time on the clock to preserve your other, far more literal life bar. Take your time, pick your moments, land those blows. It's a really good source of pressure, the two elements playing off of each other. The controls are in tune with the game's rhythms, and that's a deeply important determining factor in whether controls are really good or bad. It's whether they're fit or unfit for purpose. Frank would handle terribly in Devil May Cry just as Dante would be dead boring in Willamette. For an infamous example, take the Crash trilogy. The Insane trilogy standardized the controls between all three titles. It sounds good because Crash 1 had controls that would be considered stiff today. The issue came with the fact that the levels and obstacles were built around this old scheme. A newer system isn't inherently better, especially if it's misapplied. One action I want to highlight is once again the dodge roll. My aging fingers are getting worse at it, but I love its input. A double flick on the analog. It communicates the effort of the movement, can be tricky to do on purpose, and is all too easy to do by accident in a moment of panic. In the wrong circumstances, it's a perfect comedy of error, a massive overreaction. On the opposite end of the spectrum, not moving when you'd really want to, I mentioned firearms during the Carlito boss, particularly how Frank has to stay still to line up a shot. Why this is noteworthy is because he can still move with his camera. Now sure, a camera doesn't require the same level of accuracy, but it demonstrates that Frank's awkwardness with a gun isn't an oversight or limitation, it's further characterization via control. This is why when I look back and found a handful of outlets praising the later entries for the ability to move and shoot, talking about it as an unqualified improvement, I suddenly found myself oddly irritated. Partly because I knew I also saw it that way back when. Nowadays, with where such thinking has gotten us, I believe we didn't realize what we were moving and shooting into. It's not an improvement, it's a change. Being able to move and shoot at the same time is only an improvement when it suits the game's goals. I don't dislike being able to move and shoot in later titles. I think Stop and Pop was sensible for what Dead Rising was going for, and the game is built around it. It's only a limitation insofar as the player has to acknowledge and work with what they have. And, yeah, I'm aware, these are consumer outlets written for a general gaming population. But I think that just demonstrates what a losing battle this is. This march of progress treatment of controls, where striving towards simplicity and convenience is taken as an unambiguous good, has likely done more damage towards games having distinct identities and offering unique experiences than we've realized. For a more European extreme example, take Metal Gear Solid. 1 to the original release of 3 have fixed cameras and a unique control setup. What these do is enforce your role as a stealth operative in a high-stakes environment. Combat is a failure state or a boss fight, which often, given the unique rule set of engagement, would play out closer to puzzles or else are genuine struggles for survival. Shooting is by modern standards, deeply unintuitive, utilizing pressure-sensitive buttons to raise the gun, with a slow release to lower, and a sharp release to fire. This adds a ton of intentionality into firing. The player actively goes out of their way to pull and release the trigger, which winds up tying nicely into the lead's characterizations as heavily conflicted soldiers worn down by the war machine. At 4, the series switched over to the emerging standard, an orbiting camera with an over-the-shoulder ADS model for firing. The game is undeniably smoother, but combat is now only a failure state by suggestion. Bosses similarly suffered, becoming far more straightforwardly action-focused. The consequences and much of the experience feels flattened. Pulling the trigger feels indistinct from its far less morally conflicted contemporaries. And don't get me wrong, I still like MGS4, Peace Walker, and bits of V. But ironically, for a series all about identity, a lot was lost in chasing the popular perception of what constitutes quote-unquote good design. If you were to ask me, conveniences like standardization sit alongside massively inflated budgets, trend chasing, which is ironically in combination with disgustingly long dev cycles, overdependence on market research, and a push for everything to be online, which is why the modern mainstream is suffering from so much stagnation. Convenience isn't the biggest player at the table, but it is the most insidious. After all, it's only convenience which can stifle creativity and receive congratulations and not condemnation. It's the honey which helps the poison go down. How can games truly have their own identities if they all must play the same at the root? Control is a big aspect of what sets this medium apart, and rather than being a means of creative expression, we've treated it as a formula which can be solved and set aside. For a lot of gaming's early history, this approach made perfect sense. It had merit. Everything I've said in this section is a thought born of hindsight. I didn't foresee us arriving here, and in the past I definitely lauded this smoothing out. It's just that with where we're at now, I hope we can all loosen up and use non-standard control schemes more evocatively. The way movies might opt for film stock instead of digital, might use practical effects, black and white, sepia, not as a technical necessity, but as a means of invoking unique moods and styles. Anyway, sorry, things got a little out of control there. I said I was going to go where the game led me, and unlike Frank, I'm not trapped in this mall. To sum it all up, in Dead Rising the controls are heavy because until you master them, they're meant to weigh you down. My defense of these imperfect controls is they're actually pretty good. For this game, and this game alone. We check in with Brad and Jesse. With communications jam, they can't summon the safe passage Barnaby wants. So Frank plays another card.
There's a helicopter coming.
Is your ride reliable?
Absolutely. That's how I plan on getting out of here.
Can we take Dr. Barnaby as well?
Sure. As long as you tell me what's going on.
Okay. I'll tell you what you want to know. Later.
Leverage in place, Brad's off to pick up supplies, and for a moment, we've got nothing but time.
We'll get Dr. Barnaby here tomorrow morning. I want you to keep an eye on the monitors.
Okay, I think I've knocked all the big topics on the head for a little while, so let's relax and just shoot the shit. Shoot the shit. You know what we need? We need some guns. Uh-oh. He's Cletus, the slamfire yokel. So he's interesting folk. Besides being the first optional psychopath it's possible to encounter, he's also an unmarked one. As in, no scoops or in-game hints lead you to him, and well, it's because they don't have to. Anyone versed in zombie media is going to want to get their hands on some firearms, especially once they realise Dead Rising is hard as nails. Cletus then doesn't need to be flagged up because he's perfectly positioned to ambush the player. The developers knew a lot of people were going to check the map, see a gun store, and shoot on over, only to arrive and find another guy who had the exact same idea we had, learning the hard way that if you really want these guns, it was never going to be so simple. It's a brilliant little practical joke played on the player.
In a situation like this, I can't afford to trust nobody!
As for the fight itself, Cletus is like a supercharged, concentrated Carlito. He threatens a far smaller space, but within that zone, he's nothing short of a nightmare. Incredibly fast, deadly accurate, and his shotgun hits far harder than Carlito's P90. The displays you can use as cover are unstable and tricky to hide behind, and your window to retaliate is far smaller. For low-leveled and inexperienced players, the best move may be to retreat, and Dead Rising makes no judgments for you doing so. When I mention psychos are more often about presenting interesting scenarios, this is what I mean. Cletus' in-game actions line up accurately with how he's presented in cutscene. He's not a generic boss, but an actual character, and by understanding him, he becomes easier to evade or defeat. Even his drunkenness is translated in gameplay, providing a diegetic break in the action and explaining the extremes of his irrational behaviour. It's also a photo op, so while he downs his wine, we can drink in some PP. A fun fact, but if you sprint over here the moment the game begins, you can actually make it to the hunting shack before Cletus and help yourself. This tells me that despite being so ready to kill to protect his store, he's also absent-minded enough to ignore basic safety procedures. This is the game subtly commenting on the American propensity towards confrontation, foregoing common-sense steps to evade violence like locks or burglar alarms, because to the American psyche, the only disaster worth thinking about is one worth fantasizing about. One which can be turned into a power trip. A countrywide mass castle indoctrination. Nah, I'm just fucking with you. That's likely an oversight, perhaps an intended trick. This video's not going to get that up its own arse for at least a few more hours. I'm not that deep in the source, unlike our friend Cletus here.
Damn, mister! Come on now! What are you, crazy? You want guns so bad that y'all are willing to kill for them? Let me go!
Hey!
Please!
Hey, wait!
No! No!
So Cletus is down, but that doesn't mean getting guns is no longer a hassle. The gun store's position in the mall is pretty on point. It's the most isolated store above ground, exacerbated by a fin-infested hallway the player needs to tackle each and every time they make a trip here. In combination with the timer, it turns going to the gun store from a simple, hey, I need a couple of shotguns, into an actual decision. You have to consider whether the time the guns may save will outweigh however much is lost getting here, which makes Cletus's ambush all the more effective. This goes on to make the guns and their use all the more precious. You have to put genuine thought into when they're worth breaking out, as using them frivolously will mean another lengthy detour. This is another aspect of the power of the timer. Time is a currency which is always being spent. It adds depth to every decision and puts them all into a continuity of sorts. Choices compounding on one another, successes saving time, failures costing it, and improvising to claw back whatever you can. I like to have some shotguns handy for survivors. They massively boost their survivability and make them far more fun to escort. But I do try and minimize trips here or make it a quick detour when other objectives have me in the area. From there I stretch what guns I do get as far as they'll take me. And that in itself is more rewarding than any number of headshots. And with that out of the way, we've got places to be and things to shoot, so let's...
All right, looks like he found our next contestant. We're gonna take out that dude and snatch his old lady.
Thank you very much.
I'm having a hard time writing about the convicts because I just start singing Gonguru to myself. For the sake of the song's legacy, I'll spare you from what that sounds like. God knows it's already the cause of enough PTSD in this community without me piling it on. The convicts are essentially mini-bosses. I suppose we'll call them pseudopaths. I mentioned evasion as a valid tactic against Cletus, and no other encounter better exemplifies why Dead Rising will sometimes consider discretion the better part of valor. Given the wide open space, incredible danger they present to low-level or unarmed players, and the fact they'll respawn once a day, meaning they can be faced up to 3 times a run, no fight better encourages just getting out. I like the challenge they present. As I mentioned, the Leisure Park is a long but otherwise safe route which connects much of the complex. What the convicts do is add a dash of unpredictability into the mix. Every time you come here, they demand attention. They can be avoided, but if they roll up on you, they're capable of dealing a lot of damage to you and yours incredibly quickly, so you always have to keep an eye out for their approach. They're even more imposing on their first encounter, as it's possible you'll have both the Fresca falls behind you, as well as a cruel dilemma in front of you. Again, it's that whole thing about chaotic and unfair situations. You'll want to sit back and observe the convicts, but Sophie provides a strong incentive to act like Frank and jump in hoping for the best. This pulls you out into the open where the convicts are at their most unmanageable. Or, if you're struggling or uncertain of yourself, you can leave her to her fate and hope she draws fire away from you. I'd love to call it a Sophie's choice, but it sadly doesn't count as one, so I'll try and figure out another Sophie pun while we talk about the fight's most iconic element. I love Gonguru. It's a belter. That can't do it, sorry. Welling up like a siren lets you know your day has become a little bit more of a bastard. It's a community in-joke I'm all in on. The song itself is a genuinely funny story of a rocker who gives up the life to go guru, finding way more prowess and celebrity as the head of a dodgy sex cult. ironically living out the rock and roll lifestyle far more successfully and seedily as he pretends to be all spiritual about it. With this in mind, it actually sounds like a more appropriate track for a later boss fight. That said, I can't help but wonder if this song was chosen just for the mention of Cruz coming tight in orange pajamas, and the music video consisting of 5 minutes of footage of car crashes. From movies. Sorry, I thought it'd be funnier if I withheld that detail for a moment. The musical choices in this game dance between wonderfully subtextually fitting, especially given their licensed tracks from a smaller end self-professed anti-label CD Baby, and others seem to be chosen due to one or two bizarrely literal lines. It's not the kind of music you hear all too often in games. Dead Rising's original score is pretty eclectic. Each character has a distinctive theme, and the diegetic mole music is legendary for a reason, providing a hilariously flippant juxtaposition to all the violence happening within the building. The Psychopath fights, meanwhile, are mostly licensed tracks from small alternative or indie bands. Lifeseeker, Hostile Groove, Evolutionaries, Supernova Syndicate, and Lockjaw. This lends Dead Rising a very different sound where electronic, metal, and industrial rule the day. Besides capturing the instability of the psychopaths, how heavy and distorted the songs are create an overpowering wall of sound which sonically captures how larger than life and impossible to ignore they are, as well as communicating their instability. Gone Guru is arguably the strongest example just on its mimetic status alone, but aside from a few less impactful original tracks, none of the licensed stuff undersells their psychos. Also, fun fact, the song has a sequel on Lifeseeker's YouTube channel. Good luck understanding any of the words. Defeating these guys lets us at their jeep, which would be a lot more useful if vehicles could be used to ferry survivors. Frank can also pluck the heavy machine gun off the back. While it sports 200 rounds and deals serious damage, it comes with an atypical limitation, one we've already seen. It's a heavy object. This means it can't be stowed away in inventory, so swapping items, helping survivors, or equipping the camera will force Frank to drop it. Here, I'd wanted to take the gun over to face Cletus. You can see I'm desperate to ration ammo until it eventually dawns on me I'd cocked up and I'd need to rethink my plans. It's a really hefty drawback, and it means if you want to take out the convicts in the hopes of saving some time later, you actually have to plot out when it's best to go after them, which gives the gun even greater weight. It's a brilliant little conundrum, a reason to evade them longer or take a longer roundabout route until the time is right to go in for the kill. You know, as if that by itself is easy. When I was a kid, these guys could easily roll me, and even now getting caught off guard means you're in for a world of hurt. But they're also quite easily led, and from there filled with even more. I make a deceptive yet convincing argument to attack Frank instead of her, and get them trapped on a local flora. I guess we could say I employed Sophie's tree. Sophie's tree? Sophie's tree? Sophistry. I make it a point not to apologise for bad jokes as to not double the length of the videos, but I think even I deserve some suffering for that one. Bring in the clown! With the roller coaster on the fritz, we finally get to visit the Wonderland Plaza, a wide two-story shopping arcade centered around its child's play area. It is a bit of a soft play zone. Weapons and food are scarce here, which makes it the perfect time to meet him.
Stay away from there, Gramps!
He's the killer clown from Outer Space Rider. Adam is a wonderful take on the sad clown. I love how we start out being led to believe he was taking revenge on people laughing at him before pulling the rug and revealing he's actually upset they no longer can. It plays on expectations well. You see a clown juggling chainsaws and it's easy to assume this is an out-and-out bad guy, but it's actually way more sympathetic than that. While he isn't the most obvious example, Adam is part of a common motif shared with a handful of other psychopaths, in that they're not exactly evil. Adam is running the machine at a high speed to deter zombies, and while he has kidnapped someone and stuck them on there, it was out of noble if misguided intentions. Though I do wish we could hear them screaming throughout the fight whenever they fly past. Add a nice Doppler effect to the scream, and we've got some comedy gold. Psychopath is an inaccurate term as the game uses it, and I imagine besides just being punchy, they're conflating it with psychosis, a state which far better matches what many of the bosses are going through. Dead Rising does a good job walking a tightrope of giving the ones who deserve sympathy a degree of it while never making Frank appear evil or dismissive for killing them. He's never the one who escalates, and in all but 2 situations he is acting in self-defense. Returning to cinematography for a moment, I love how the blocking is often used to portray Frank as small or isolated. He's always dwarfed by the circumstances surrounding him, always keeping in mind that he's an ordinary guy in extraordinary circumstances. In pre-boss cutscenes, the psychopaths dominate the frame. This establishes a David and Goliath dynamic, which makes coming out the other end alive all the more meaningful. In Adam's introduction, which is iconic for a reason, we get a lot of low angles which sells him as intimidating. This is how he appears to Frank, as a towering presence. Frank himself is frequently framed through Adam's juggled chainsaws, which besides being a powerful image tells us he's already in Adam's clutches, and the constant push-ins keep the tension continually rising. The camera movement is dynamic without losing focus or over-egging. There's a mild use of shaky cam throughout, and while Frank's a photojournalist and not a documentarian, it feels within the game's journalism theme and gives goings-on a little extra dash of discomfort. Just like I spoke about with the Fresca lot, Adam the Clown is a serious leap in difficulty. He's one of the toughest fights in the game, and while I like this encounter a lot, I think it creates a problem. That being, Adam makes every other boss look downright simplistic by comparison. His moveset is far more fully featured and comes with an absolute clown car worth of tricks, which could have stood to be spread around a little more. His get-up stun comes out fast and makes attacking him while he's down risky. He has a slower standing variant alongside a quick jab, which both serve to push away an overly aggressive player or force distance, as well as a block which can shred melee weapons. From there, he has a long-ranged punish, which forces us to either give up on firearms or else quickly move and reacquire him as a target, which requires a good deal of speed and accuracy. Adam the Clown is tricky in every sense of the word, requiring the player to frequently change up tactics against him. And this is before getting to Adam's most important feature. He can downright block bullets when he's not mid-action, forcing the player into tight windows if they want to stay at range. I'd argue this is a feature which shouldn't have just been limited to Adam, as while it spits in the face of realism, guns let you play keep away with a lot of the bosses, which short-circuits having to learn them at all. He can also roam freely. If you're in the Wonderland Plaza, you're not safe, and it leads to some real travelling battles. No other boss really compares. This isn't entirely a negative, many bosses are memorable because of the scenario around them or a unique gimmick which mixes them up. Meanwhile, Adam's gimmick is being fully featured. He is perhaps the most traditional boss fight in the game, and he's a lot of fun. Fighting him is very call and response. You have to figure out his rhythm and play to it. It's a double act. Where'd my... In fact, on my first run here, I did something really stupid. I'd gotten him caught in a loop and figured, this is making things too easy. And so I decided to show off a little. I'll say, my little sideshow didn't go down well. One interesting thing Dead Rising does is obscure your health a little. Not to the extent of the older Resident Evil's EKG, but its true value is somewhat hidden. Under the hood, Frank still has a purely numerical health value, but it's represented by blocks which have some ambiguity to them. Adam lets us demonstrate this as his big telegraph flip attack does a meaty 3 blocks worth of pain. Meanwhile, his quick jab is still dealing damage, but it may not even break a block. The easiest way to spot this is with zombie swipes or falling damage, which occasionally appear to have no effect. While it wouldn't work for every game, it suits Dead Rising, and it's a fun use of ambiguity. That said, I can't pretend to know what the intent was behind only giving players an approximation of their health, whether the uncertainty was meant to make you more cautious or courageous. I suppose ideally it would make a player 1 or 2 blocks away from death overestimate the danger they're in and get food sooner than they may truly need it. Perhaps even having a miracle moment when an attack they feel should kill them winds up just glancing off of their last square, letting them feel they've experienced something death-defying and bounced back, even though numerically they had more than enough gas in the tank. Regardless, I do not get a miracle moment. And I earned my first death. The original release had a somewhat controversial save system.
Except for the fact that the save system is awful. The save system in this game is borderline broken, and it's punishing and mean-spirited, in that you only get one save in the entire game.
The Xbox 360 introduced user profiles, and each got just one save. This meant swapping save slots was a limited and cumbersome process. There was no easy way to rotate saves or save scum. On top of that, saving took effort. It's only available at certain points around the mall. If you're uncertain you'll make it through a situation, you had to make a diversion, spending time to essentially buy insurance. The 2016 re-release we're playing adds several save slots, and I can't complain. It means if I want to do a level 1 run, I don't have to destroy all of my progress or slowly swap out profiles just for the privilege, and it definitely helped me get some bonus footage for one-off events. The more contentious aspect, however, especially given the lack of autosaves, was it meant a game over could be truly time-consuming, costing hours worth of progress. Or in my case, the entire run. You see, I've always felt Dead Rising wants a player to do a full reset on death, and my reaction calcified way back when. I'm not saying you have to do that, but it feels in keeping with the spirit of the game and adds to the excitement. After all, it makes retreating from overwhelming situations an actual decision because now there's something to actually lose. If not Frank's life, then the several hours of yours you've spent together. I'd recommend trying to play it this way, at least once, just to see if you might find that same thrill in the added drama. And if not, at least you gave it a shot. Not all is lost, and in fact, much is still gained. Your levels are tied to your save slot and carried forward, so Frank comes in a little more sturdy each and every time until he hits the cap at 50. Leveling is a semi-randomized affair. With each level, Frank will either see one of his stats grow or learn a new skill. Every speed and inventory buff in particular feels like a weight is being lifted, and I adore the arsenal of skills Frank develops. One of the earliest moves you unlock is the jump kick, and the 20 or so minutes before you have it are genuinely jarring to me. It's downright integral to Frank's moveset. Its quick speed makes it a great emergency way to buy some space, and its low damage gives you a solid means to rescue or encourage stuck survivors. It also allows you to take a lot of little cut-throughs while barely slowing down. Barely. What makes the move a bit deeper is it causes Frank to momentarily halt on landing. This means it isn't just a straight upgrade to a normal jump, it's something you can only use when appropriate. If you whiff the kick or use it poorly, that split second could lead to a split carotid. The jump evolves further when Frank learns the roundhouse, which requires tight timing on landing to throw out and can still be done after a jump kick. It's a satisfying little combo and allows a player a means of saving themselves from a bad landing or just pumping out some bonus damage. That's if they've got the reflexes. The wall kick, somersault, and drop knee only take things further, all three possessing their own requirements and utility. The jump in Dead Rising is utterly absurd. It winds up possessing greater depth than most platformers. Meanwhile, the zombie ride and jump dare you to use a zombie as a launch pad. It's a really rewarding traversal mechanic, deeply satisfying as it requires getting uncomfortably close to the undead to pull off, a risk and reward structure many of Dead Rising's later grapples follow. The hammer throw and zombie lift are not only great for managing crowds and clearing paths, but they're the hidden survivor mobility tech you never knew you needed. They also reward the player for careful positioning and really sell to me just how smoothly Frank moves. Frank also learns a series of grapple escapes. When grabbed, it's a stick-waggling QTE to abort the chomping. These unlocks add extra maneuvers which require extra precision in a tight window to pull off. Instead of merely getting out of the zombie's grip, Frank will turn the hold around, killing his attacker and often clearing surrounding zombies. While not the most thrilling moves, they're noteworthy given how rare it is for games to even attempt to add decision-making to QTEs. And the decision-making they add is surprisingly nuanced, as they make escapes both easier and harder. Easier because you can flail in more directions, harder because you can now overthink what you're doing. The double lariat is for me the most useful non-jump move in the game. A wide crowd clearer and astounding damage dealer. It has sensible drawbacks given its length and long recovery, and even has a unique quirk. The move can be done unarmed, but it gains extra damage and range if done with a weapon. However, Butterfingers Frank here will fling whatever he was using at the end of the move, sending it flying across the room. So you can give the move some extra oomph, at the cost of a weapon or the time spent recovering it. It's a nice dash of depth. Not everything's a winner. I can't say I care for the football tackle, and both the neck twist and giant swing are overshadowed by the drop knee and lariat respectively, both being easier to use and putting the player at less risk for not much less reward. Perhaps the biggest disappointment to me is the final unlock, the zombie walk. Ending the leveling system on a gag was always underwhelming to me, especially since by now the player will know time is of the essence and has a plethora of means to evade or dispatch rotters far more quickly. The need to trigger the walk a good distance away from zombies to fool them only renders it all the more useless. Perhaps if survivors followed in Frank's fumbling footsteps it would have some niche uses, but as it is, it feels closer to a reference than an actual mechanic. And after the depth some of the moves possess, its straightforwardness and lack of utility stands out all the more. Overall, the dull moves are the exception, and Frank's endgame arsenal turns him into a really fun and flexible character to play. It's the best kind of skill set. Much of what Frank can do has hidden depths and seemingly spontaneous secondary uses that an inventive player can get more out of. And that's because it's not just Frank who grows, but the player alongside them, learning those tricks, learning them all. The cut-through, shortcuts, time saves, best weapons and food. I actually feel a little melancholy over all this, because I myself can never do a true level 1 run ever again. I tried to emulate it. I jumped right into recording after a good many years away from the game, coming in as rusty as possible and even trying to play suboptimally. I intentionally ignored the skateboard, mixed drinks, Bill. I tried to act as I think I did when I was fresh, and This didn't work out. Not just because I literally failed. I mean because I barely managed to stick to those guns, and yet Frank is still lying in a pool of his own plasma. I still instinctually used the jump as a small dodge, beeline for Roastmasters, nabbed hidden Uzis, and barely had to pause and check the map. I said it's a shame I can't wipe Dead Rising from my memory and experience it fresh, and even with my continually worsening memory and several years of separation, some habits die a whole lot harder than I do. Frank starts off as fairly incapable, and by level 50 he can tear through most of the mall with just his bare hands. But it still falls to the player to put those hands to good use, and the game remains reasonably difficult. Sure, getting through the main story becomes eminently doable, but Psychos are still dangerous, and Saint remains daunting. In this regard, the game escalates really well. A fresh player can be happy just to survive. After learning the ropes, clearing the story is rewarding, but then the Saint run acts as a final exam of sorts. Differing levels of commitment and skill level all have a gaming accomplishment that they can be happy with. Okay, time for round 2. Oh, wait. Adam, give me a minute. Yeah, okay, cheers. Alright, get to it later, pal. Alright, I'm down to clown and the clown is down. And here I thought he'd already spilled his guts when we met him. It's a pretty gruesome death, a potent moment of pitch black comedy. Defeating Adam gives us a reward bonanza. Psychopaths often add unique items and other trinkets to the mall after they're defeated, offering tangible long-term benefits for taking them down, which makes them worth doing no matter how many times you play, as they can really expand your options for the rest of a run. But again, like the fight itself, the rest sadly struggle to top Adam. First up, we can ride the Space Rider. Awesome. This gives us access to the game's sneakiest hidden Uzi. We also get Greg off the ride, and the fact his reward isn't the star of the show says a lot. He'll show us a sneaky shortcut which warps us between Wonderland and Paradise, which is an insane time save. But culling the clown hasn't just cut them all in half, but the difficulty as well. The Mini Chainsaw. This bad boy is a literal game changer. Years ago I covered the excellent Source multiplayer mod Fistful of Frags, digging into its brilliant weapon balancing built around stronger weapons having lower score payouts. Taking a moment in particular to lavish praise on its pump shotgun by saying that in a game filled with weapons with steep caveats and trade-offs, its strength was playing like it came from a more standard FPS. Other guns may be more powerful, but this had by far the greatest ease of use. The Mini Chainsaw is similar. As we've gone over, Dead Rising is a high commitment title. Frank is almost lumbering in his actions, and fast weapons come with significant downsides in terms of range, damage, and crowd control. The Mini Chainsaw has no such drawbacks. It's a powerful medium-range weapon which Frank wields with what are practically flicks of the wrist. The first thing the saw severs are your commitments. The power of the Mini Chainsaw is that it functions closer to a weapon from a traditional hack and slasher, and hack and slash this thing does. It downright cuts the game in half, and I honestly rejected it for the first couple of runs because of this. It's a lot like the difficulty argument. You can turn it up or down, but the fact an option is there has indelible effects on everything around it. Depending on how you look at it, the Mini Chainsaw may be one of Dead Rising's biggest flaws. And we're not quite done with this weapon, but that's because, well, we gotta book it. Another scoop is pressing us to the nearby Sir Book Salon, where Japanese tourists Yu and Shinji are hiding out. Besides providing a skit, what these two do is make the player at least have to read up on books, which, speaking from personal experience, was a good call. The value books would provide isn't intuitive in the same way weapons or food is, so in this case they had to lead the player to Waterstones, even if they can't quite make us drink. Books provide various buffs, boosting the efficacy of healing items, increasing PP gain from various sources, perhaps even lending Frank passive abilities or adding extra functions to certain items. The most common and meaningful effect, however, is increasing the durability of weapon categories. I haven't delved into durability yet. It's another little loved mechanic which I believe Dead Rising shows has its place. It pairs perfectly well with playing as an ordinary everyman survivor in a shopping mall full of eclectic and unexpected weapons. It leads to those exhilarating moments where your best gear breaks and you suddenly find yourself having to improvise, fending off ghouls with whatever it is you can get your hands on. It also further bulks up the clock, since now rearming has an extra associated time cost. Breakable weapons provide a unique form of friction, where even if you're playing well and avoiding damage, you will still run into complications. I appreciate how durability is kept hidden from the player until whatever you're wielding is close to breaking. It gives you just enough warning to know that you need to be thinking about what comes next. Not to mention the low durability effect is subtle, meaning it's possible to not notice your weapon is fading if your attention is elsewhere, which in high-stress situations or when overwhelmed, closer aligns the player with Frank. It's believable he may not notice his gear is giving up on him in the heat of the moment. Books alleviate this stress, but not without their own costs. In exchange for an inventory slot or two, you reduce durability as a concern, but only for thin categories of weapons. You'll be able to use your preferred gear for longer, but if you're not careful, it can make rearming trickier, especially if your chosen tools aren't the most convenient to source. So while I don't use them too much, I do like the books being here. They add an extra dash of strategy, allowing players a means of defining their own playstyle, and it does this in a manner which slots into the game sensibly and doesn't bog it down in needless RPG subsystems and bloat. And god, this timing is disgustingly perfect for the mini chainsaw, since it counts as a cutting implement, an engineering tool, and an entertainment object. This makes it qualify for the effects of 3 different boosters, each tripling its durability. And these effects aren't additive, but multiplicative. This takes it from an already respectable 80 hits to a downright staggering 2,160. Played conservatively, that many attacks can take you from here to endgame. Even if you go a little wild, you'll still only need to make 1 or 2 return trips. In most cases, trading up 4 inventory slots is a serious commitment. But as we've gone over, the mini chainsaw severs those. Part of the problem with Dead Rising's systems all working towards the same goal is that any and all upsets are far more pronounced than if the game were less harmonious. I've lavished a lot of praise on Dead Rising, so let me be clear. I don't love this game because it's perfect. It's very much not. I love it because so much of it appeals to me, and it remains a really engaging and unique title in spite of its issues. Many of its blemishes do wind up feeling like texture and personality. They're an acquired taste. The mini chainsaw isn't the only overpowered bit of gear, to be fair. Take the mannequin torso, which bodies the competition, and is in arm's reach every time you leave the security room. There are upsetting upsets in the overall balancing, and this does more to harm the central conceit of using whatever you want in a mall full of fun toys than the timer ever could. It's just harder to notice because it's convenient. Despite all I've said, I am not knocking anyone for using the mini chainsaw. We're all guilty of taking the path of least resistance sometimes. And this does come from a place of hypocrisy because I do owe my eventual Saint run to a booked up chainsaw. Not that I'm giving myself an out on this, but it's something I talked about in the enemy video. I enjoy unfair games when they give perceptive players a means to be unfair right back. The mini chainsaw may be a step too far, mine. Closer towards the optimizing the fun out of a game part of the spectrum. Anyway, you and Shinji. Part of me would have liked it if we had to keep the Japanese conversation book on hand to issue more complicated objectives while they're in our party, but that's a small quibble. And not wanting them to feel the USA was a letdown, I helped make their American holiday complete. With a brand spanking new shortcut available, we cut across paradise and these two, plus good old Greg, are home free. At 7 PM, the zombies undergo a change. Their eyes turn a glowing red, highlighting their increased hardiness and aggression. Supposedly. I've always found these effects to be subtle and can't claim to have noticed much of a difference myself. But that isn't all that sets Dead Rising zombies apart, as a cutscene featuring Frank being perturbed by some of fiction's most docile undead has him make a strange discovery.
What in the hell is going on around here?
The infection in Dead Rising isn't spread solely via bites, but through highly aggressive wasps, which makes for an interesting addition. Besides heightening the creepiness, especially for me being deathly afraid of the little pricks in real life, it's quite a shrewd way to get around a question a lot of films know would be inconvenient to dig into. Zombies are a fun movie monster, but they're also built on a series of contradictions. They're slower, stupider, and frailer than your average person. but for the sake of the story will easily overtake humanity in number before an effective response can be mustered. We all get jumped by a creature incapable of even that much athleticism. Meanwhile, the protagonist will usually score quite a number of kills once the initial shock has worn off. It's why the ending of Shaun of the Dead works so well as a subversion. The moment the military turns up, the crisis is effectively over, something Dead Rising also plays with in its own much darker way. Insect stings as a vector for infection is not only unnerving, it just feels that bit more believable the spreading infection could fly under the radar until it's too big for most ordinary people to handle. It even became a running gag among zombie fans that these films take place in a world where the mere concept of a zombie has never crossed anyone's mind before, to give them a fighting chance. As audiences grew more savvy to cliches and poked fun at them, media changed in turn. Perhaps unwisely given how much of that joking was out of affection, but there we go. Steadily moving away from the word zombie altogether to the point where saying it wrapped around to being noteworthy.
You looking to get yourself eaten alive by zombies?
Don't say that.
Yeah, oddly enough, Shaun of the Dead is going to come up way more often than the movie this game claims to have nothing to do with, and legally does not. This trend may have also played a part in the rise of fast or intelligent zombies, which is a topic that we'll circle around to later given its odd relevance to Dead Rising's conceptualization. And again, Shaun of the Dead somehow. In gameplay, queens act like a zombie grenade, clearing out large groups and leaving behind larvae, which like the zombies grow aggressive by night. These add another inventory consideration, being incredibly effective, albeit one-use items, which are completely useless against psychos and other human enemies yet to be introduced. Do you trade a longer-lasting weapon or precious healing for a single-use grenade? I myself like to have one or two in reserve as Frank's stock expands. They're great in emergencies, able to quickly open up paths or save overwhelmed survivors. Far better than shotguns anyway. They're both a clever addition to Dead Rising's arsenal, and a great way to set its zombies apart. And from here, day one comes to a leisurely close, and Jesus, what a day it's been. I'd forgotten just how many iconic moments the game hits/beats/kills you with in its opening hours. I've covered wars, you know, the convicts, Adam the Clown, even Cletus. Unlike Frank, Dead Rising hits the ground running. It knows how to make a first impression. But we've still got one last pickup, and luckily it's a pick-me-up. This will take us to the western end of the North Plaza. What's pleasant about this is if we've unlocked it, we can immediately backtrack right through the shortcut we just opened, which I quite enjoy. The game wastes no time rewarding our efforts and cementing the shortcut's benefits in our minds. Anything routed through here is a piece of piss. Paying it off this way feels like the game patting us on the back for making it this far, and it means we get to end day one on a bit of a high. Feeling like, hey, maybe things are going to be alright, which is exactly the morale boost we need before the utter chaos which is day two. David trembles in fear over Frank's sheer gluttony. No doubt rattled by his recent encounter in Sion's food and stuff, hinting at a future boss fight. You might think with his injury that David would be one of the more troublesome survivors, but he's quite the opposite. For all my defense of the escort system, I can't pretend there isn't an issue when the response to a survivor with a busted leg is a shattered hip hip hooray. Besides not having to worry about them following orders since you literally carry them, the added weight leads to Frank bulldozing through zombies with ease. As long as you remain mobile, you're practically invulnerable. I suppose I gotta ask, who's carrying who here? I think it would be more accurate to say David delivers us back home for the night. When on their own, the infirm survivors are firm favourites, as they're ironically a power-up, which I suppose is why lone injured survivors are such a rarity. We're left with a little bit of free time before 6 AM, which gives us a moment to catch our breath, resupply, and maybe blow off some steam. It's just dawning on me that it's a good opportunity to hit up the gun shop. That said, I'm sticking close to home because we're going to talk about the security room. There's an optional cutscene somewhere in this stretch, with Brad dropping off supplies. There isn't a ton to talk about here story-wise, more Frank and Brad clarifying their positions, Brad wanting to play it by the book and Frank reiterating that the book has been chewed up and spat out. It is notable that this time Brad doesn't argue the point, so Frank is making some ground here. Which brings me to an odd topic. While I don't have anything against data mining, it's definitely not for me. I find an odd melancholy in knowing that there's nothing more to know. One of the biggest things I missed from when I was a kid was not knowing the limitations of games. In my mind, they would just stretch out infinitely if I kept looking for new things. One gaming memory I think about a lot was a car combat game I had when I was a tiny child. I think it was Grudge Warriors for the PS1, at least it's the most similar looking game on my search. In one of the multiplayer maps there was a pitch dark cave. I used to think it stretched out far deeper than it seemed. I was just driving in there endlessly. What was really going on was the dancing of pixels on a CRT. In my mind, I was traveling down endless pitch dark halls. In reality, I was driving against a wall. I was always thrown when I turned around and found the cave exit right there. It's a really stupid trick I played on myself. Player 1's allegory of the cave. Extras like this thoroughly optional, unsignposted cutscene recreate that magic for me, as they make the game feel more like a living object. As if over the course of the 3 days the other characters are active and playing their parts, and if I were lucky I might even find them around the mall. The logical part of me knows it's an illusion, but the side of me seeking that veil will always be pleased to feel validated. Naturally, as characters come and go, they'll have incidental dialogue, which is a nice and easy way to flesh them out without requiring a whole new cutscene. I cracked some jokes about Jessie earlier, but she does become far more amiable to Frank by this point, dropping the aloof agent shtick since we're all in this together and Frank's pulling his weight. This apologetic text box is interesting because once you've read it, it's far easier to interpret Jessie's later jabs at Frank's expense as more light-hearted banter. Meanwhile, if you miss it, she can still come off as nothing more than needlessly mean, which I believe makes for a good use case for text boxes. If you care about the character's input, you're given an extra angle on them. You can interpret their later dialogue with extra layers. You can also occasionally get foreshadowing for later story events, which Frank, impartial observer that he clearly is, won't act on. That's one of the downsides of incidental dialogue like this. Very few games can account for and modify the story around something so tangential, so it can't be written as too revelatory without frustrating the player when their character doesn't act on something that they really ought to know. It's a disconnect I've seen a few games stumble into, and Dead Rising has some guilty moments, especially around Barnaby when he gets here. His developing infection may not be as obvious to Frank as it is to the viewer. Granted, Frank does have the excuse that Barnaby's an old geezer who gets tranquilized and goes through an experience which would be strenuous for people half his age, so it's debatable if Frank should be suspicious. It's a pretty one-sided debate. One detail I like is how in the early game the security room will have a refreshing stockpile of food and drink, which makes returning here that bit more welcoming, and ensures you can head back into the mall at full strength. As time goes by, these supplies disappear. It's a small but nonetheless tangible way to make the player notice the situation worsening, and it does this far more effectively than a character just declaring that things are getting worse in a cutscene, since this affects the player directly and mechanically. We get to feel things getting just that bit tighter. I know when I was younger I suddenly felt uneasy whenever I realised the food was gone. The intensity had climbed, even if just a little. Another thing which makes the security room less welcoming as time goes by?
Just leave it to me.
I do get some satisfaction seeing the place fill with the people I've saved, but as a reward, it backfires spectacularly as the racket becomes unbearable. There is no way on earth the developers couldn't have noticed how the unending wails and crying, while perhaps not inappropriate, are bloody annoying. I can't sleep when there's a tap dripping on the other side of the house, but Frank's a champ. And again, he has covered wars, you know.
Just leave it to me.